Chapter 427. Why? Because he was too shocked, Li Xian's voice trembled as he spoke. Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Do you believe that there is something that can prolong one's life and make them immortal after eating it?" Li Xian was stunned for a moment, then he turned around and walked outside. "I'll go and capture those Taoists immediately." He didn't know if there was such a thing, but if Li Yi said there was no such thing, then there was definitely no such thing. Wait. Li Yi stopped him. This matter wasn't anyone's fault, but the world's understanding of the so-called pills. Which emperor didn't want to live forever? There were so many emperors in history who knew that taking pills was harmful to their bodies, but didn't they still take them? Whether it was a commoner or a noble, death was a very terrifying thing for most people. The upper class was all taking pills, so who would believe them if they were told that doing so was actually courting death? So many people were dreaming of immortality, even Li Xian didn't realize what kind of resistance he would encounter. "I have to tell Uncle Huang immediately." Li Xian turned around and said, then he turned around and was about to leave. "Who do you think will believe you?" Li Yi asked. Li Xian's footsteps stopped, and after standing on the spot for a long time, he walked back dispiritedly, hugged another piece of ice, sat back down, and said, "Then what should we do? Tell me." A long time ago, Li Xian understood that this was the most effective way to solve problems and difficulties that he couldn't solve. What's the hurry? Anyway, we've already taken so many pills, 1 or 2 more won't matter. Do you want to eat some grapes? Li Yi waved his hand and said. Can you be more serious? Li Xian's eyelids couldn't help but twitch as he looked at him and asked. Are you going to eat or not? Yes. These grapes are not bad, I'll take some back later, the princess likes sweet things. Li Xian spat out the grape skin and said. No more. While eating a bunch of grapes, he didn't forget to show his affection. Li Yi simply refused his unreasonable request. What should we do? After eating the grapes, Li Xian's expression finally became serious. Wait, Li Yi said. Wait for what? Waiting for someone. Before Li Xian could ask again, Li Yi pointed to the door and said, They're here. Lord Li, you must help us. Imperial physician Lu Jimin walked into the room with a pale face. It had only been 2 hours since they last met, but his complexion had become much more haggard. He definitely couldn't let the old emperor continue to take those elixirs. Li Yi still hoped that the old emperor could live for another 2 years, so that the effect of his token would always be there. If he really waited for the king of Shu to rise to power, he didn't think that he would have a good life. However, this matter couldn't be directly said. The temptation of longevity and immortality was very big, and Li Yi didn't think that he had the ability to change the world. If he stood out and disagreed, he would be treated as a fool. If they liked to take elixirs, then let them take them. It was healthier to take them. Anyway, since those things could be passed down to the present, there wouldn't be any problems in a few years. If they liked to dream, then let them. He just wanted to take care of his own affairs. As for the old emperor's health, perhaps even he himself didn't care as much as imperial physician Lu. If the old emperor suddenly passed away because of taking elixirs, no one knew what would happen to the other imperial physicians, but this imperial physician definitely wouldn't be able to escape. Lord Lu, don't worry. If you have anything to say, sit down and talk slowly. Li Yi said with a smile. Li Xian finally breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that Li Yi had already made arrangements. He looked at him with a somewhat resentful gaze. If he had said it earlier, he wouldn't have been so worried just now. At this time, imperial physician Lu also gradually calmed down. He knew that since Li Yi could remind him, he wouldn't just sit back and do nothing. He carefully said, Lord Li, please enlighten me. Letting the emperor stop taking elixirs was not a decision that he could make alone. There were too many things involved, and if he wasn't careful, he could lose his head. Xiao Huan, give me one of your hawthorn pills. Li Yi turned his head and said to the little maidservant. Xiao Huan usually carried a small treasure bag with her, which was filled with various snacks. When she heard Li Yi's words, she immediately took out a thumb-sized round thing wrapped in white paper. After handing it to Li Yi, she didn't forget to take out one for herself and put it into her mouth. Hawthorn pills were sweet and sour. Even if you ate too much, you wouldn't fall out. She still had a lot of them in her treasure bag. Lord Lu, take a look. What do you think of this thing? Li Yi opened the white paper that wrapped the hawthorn pill and handed it to Imperial Physician Lu. Lord Li, this. Imperial Physician Lu looked at the thing in his hand and then looked at Li Yi. He wanted to say something but stopped. This was just an ordinary hawthorn pill. It had only appeared in the capital not long ago. His grandson liked it very much. He didn't understand what this thing had to do with the emperor's illness. Believing that Li Yi's action must have a purpose, Imperial Physician Lu looked at his hand again and said, "This hawthorn pill has a bright color. It can help children to eliminate stagnation. Now that the weather is hot, it's very useful." Hearing Imperial Physician Lu's words, Li Xian shamelessly asked Xiao Huan for one. He held it in his hand and began to study it. This hawthorn pill is very similar to the pill that the Imperial Physicians Bureau has recently developed to treat the emperor's chronic illness. Li Yi looked at Imperial Physician Lu and said. Lu Jimin froze for a moment. When did the Imperial Physicians Bureau develop a pill to treat the emperor's chronic illness? This hawthorn pill had nothing to do with it. Li Yi shook his head again and said, "It's just that the taste is a bit off. If it was a bit more bitter, I'm afraid it could be passed off as genuine." Lord Li, when did the Imperial Physicians Bureau? Imperial Physician Lu was even more confused. Halfway through his words, he raised his head and looked at Li Yi. He suddenly froze and the wrinkles on his old face gradually smoothed out. "Don't worry about the taste. If it's too sweet, just soak it in cactus juice." Imperial Physician Lu stood up and respectfully bowed to Li Yi and said, "Thank you, Lord Li. Lu and my colleagues will never forget Lord Li's kindness." Li Xian chewed the hawthorn pill in his mouth and looked at the back of Imperial Physician Lu, hurriedly leaving with a dumbfounded face. "What are you guys talking about?" He looked at Li Yi and asked in confusion. At this moment, His Royal Highness had a feeling that his brain wasn't enough to process what was going on. "Eat your hawthorn pill." Li Yi put his hands behind his head and leaned on the rocking chair. As he swayed, Xiao Huan obediently massaged his shoulders. Sure enough, old people become shrewd. Imperial Physician Lu looked so honest, but with just a little reminder, the evil thoughts in his stomach immediately came out. The emperor's illness was actually a terminal illness. No matter if it was now or in the future, there was no effective cure. However, although it was difficult to live a long life, he wouldn't die in a short period of time. This summer was so hot that ordinary people were so stuffy that they couldn't breathe. How could a person with asthma be any better? He didn't need to take any pills. As long as he paid more attention to the details of his life, didn't overwork, didn't drink alcohol, did a good job of preventing heatstroke, and maintained air circulation, his illness would naturally improve. Eating a hawthorn pill was also very good to stimulate his appetite. He just didn't know if the hawthorn pill soaked in cactus juice would still be effective. Chapter 428. The farmers of the manor where the Viscount's mansion was located had been very comfortable these days. On such a hot day, they could do nothing but go to the newly built brothel in front of the manor to watch shows, listen to music, and spend a copper coin to buy a bowl of mung bean smoothie to eat. It was so comfortable. For some reason, even though it was noon, the inside of the brothel didn't feel stuffy at all. On the contrary, it was very cool. The mung bean smoothie was sold outside for 10 coppers per bowl, and the farmers in the brothel could eat to their heart's content for 1 copper coin. Everyone in the brothel praised this Lord Jew. As for the farmers who helped in the brothel, they even saved a copper coin. When they went home, they could even hold a piece of ice to cool their wives and children. Ice was a rare thing on such a hot day. It was said that only the palace had it. Because of this, the farmers had received many envious gazes from the neighboring villages. And the servants of the Li family were naturally the most comfortable. Even the maids who cleaned the courtyard could wrap a piece of ice in a brocade handkerchief and hide it in their arms. If they were thirsty and hot, they could go to the kitchen to get free mung bean soup to drink. It was all chilled. They could sit in the corridor and chat while enjoying the cool without worrying about being scolded by the master. As long as they were smart, diligent, and did their jobs well, even the most serious stewardly wouldn't scold them. Working as a servant in the Viscount's mansion, they had more time to rest than to work every day. They had never thought that being a servant could be like this. Every minute, they felt as if they had reached the peak of their lives, and they could live like this for the rest of their lives. Li Yi found that he might have been used to being busy in Qing and prefecture. After a few days of idleness, he felt a little itchy. He prepared for classes and thought about other things at the same time. Li Xian threw all the account books of many shops to him. Li Yi just skimmed through them and threw them all away. The hotter the weather was, the better the sales of perfume and rui nectar were. The money was brought back by carts. Li Yi was considering whether to further expand the ice-making workshop. If he sold mung bean smoothie to civilians and ice cubes at a high price to those who were not short of money, such as the dignitaries in the capital or the emperor, he should be able to make a lot of money. The initial construction of the brothel was going to burn a lot of money. At present, they had to make use of all possible means to earn money. Old Man Sun and the others had already established a foothold in Jingdo, but because of a lack of manpower, they could not continue to expand. If they wanted to reach the level of prosperity of Qing and Fu, it might still take a long time. Yongning's illness had always been on his mind, but there had been no progress so far. She was still very resistant to outsiders and never spoke to him. After sorting out his thoughts, Li Yi realized that he still had a lot of things to do. Just as Li Yi was writing those strange numbers and symbols on the paper, in the palace, Prince Jin, Li Han, was sweating profusely as he ran into a palace. He shook a prince who was taking a nap and said, "Li Xiang, have you finished your math homework?" "Brother, what are you doing?" A 7 or 8-year-old boy rubbed his sleepy eyes and said with dissatisfaction. "Don't ask so much. Tell me, have you done your math homework?" Li Han asked anxiously. "No." The young man mumbled, turned around, and went back to sleep. That's good, that's good." Li Han quickly ran out and quickly rushed into another palace. Not long after, he ran out of the palace with a smile on his chubby face. He murmured, "Sister Shaoning, Li Xiang, and Li Mo didn't do it. The others didn't do it either. What do I have to be afraid of? Is he going to hit all of our hands?" For a moment, Li Han was completely relaxed. With his hands behind his back, he swaggered towards his palace. The weather was as hot as ever, and there was no more ice to be bestowed today. Yongning seemed to have a lot, but he didn't dare to rob her anymore. "Steward Chang, long time no see." When he saw Changda at the palace gate, Li Yi raised his hand to greet him. "Indeed, long time no see. County Magistrately, you really ran far this time," Changda said indifferently. Eunuchs always spoke in a strange tone, and Li Yi was already used to it. The next moment, he heard him say, "His Majesty wants to see you. Come with me." The old emperor summoned him at the right time. He deliberately didn't eat breakfast when he left home in the morning, so he was a little hungry now. "All right, no need to be so polite." When he walked into the palace, before he had time to salute, Emperor Jing waved his hand and asked, "Is there really a problem with the elixir I took?" Jing Di leaned against the headboard of the bed. His complexion was undoubtedly much worse than the last time Li Yi saw him. Li Yi looked at Li Xian and Emingzu who were standing by the bed, and then looked at Emperor Jing. He said helplessly, "That elixir is not good for His Majesty's illness." "All right, I understand. You can leave." A trace of imperceptible sadness appeared in Emperor Jing's eyes. He waved his hand and said. Li Yi and the other two left the palace. Li Xian said, including the imperial physician, several officials of the Imperial Physician Bureau have been fined half a year's salary. Since it has happened, it is impossible to hide it from Uncle Huang. Li Yi waved his hand. This ending was already very good. Half a year's salary was better than losing their heads. The officials of the Imperial Physician Bureau might be celebrating now. In this case, it was up to the old emperor to decide whether to take the elixir or not. He was going to deal with Prince Jean now. He was going to teach the princes and princesses a lesson. Yesterday, he had asked Emingzu to ask the old emperor. Li Yi walked quickly in the direction of Bowen Hall. At this time, in the main hall, Emperor Jing looked in a certain direction and murmured, "Is the so-called longevity really illusory? Doesn't His Majesty already have the answer in his heart?" A voice came from there, and a middle-aged Taoist in a blue robe came out from behind the pillar. The middle-aged Taoist had black hair and a ruddy complexion. There were no wrinkles, but the vicissitudes of life in his eyes were extremely inconsistent with his appearance. "How is it?" Emperor Jing looked away and looked at him. "I can't see clearly." The middle-aged Taoist shook his head and said. Emperor Jing wondered, "There is someone that Taoist Yuan can't see clearly?" The middle-aged Taoist smiled and said, "The way of heaven is unpredictable. It is already a great fortune for me to be able to see 1 or 2 out of 10,000. What's more, since His Majesty has decided to let me see him, then what difference does it make to His Majesty whether I see him or not?" Emperor Jing did not ask again this time. The expression on his face was thoughtful. In the main hall, there was a long silence. Today's Bowen Hall was not hot. After all, the princes and princesses enjoyed special privileges. Huge ice cubes were placed in the ice mirror, and in the 4 corners of the hall, there were eunuchs holding huge feather fans, sparing no effort to fan the air. The hall was naturally cool, which made the princes feel that it was much better than the palaces they lived in. Today is the first class. Everyone should first hand in the homework that I left behind a few months ago. Li Yi sat in front and glanced at the princes and princesses. Prince Jean Lihan sat below, the corners of his mouth twitching disdainfully. "Everyone did not take your words seriously. Let's see how you clean up later." At this moment, Princess Shaoning stood up and walked up with a thin booklet in her hand. Then Prince Fu Lixiang. Prince Shou Liemo, Princess Qingyang. Princess Yongtai. Li Han looked dumbly at his brothers and sisters who came forward to hand over the booklet in their hands to the teacher. He was instantly stunned. "Liar, all liars." After a moment, his expression became angry, and when Li Yi looked at him, the anger immediately turned into fear. "Your Royal Highness Prince Jean, what about you?" When this demonic voice came, Prince Jean could not help but shiver. He no longer considered the problem of trust between people, because that thin booklet had been torn up by him along with the textbook a few months ago. Chapter 429. You. During the lesson, Prince Jin's face turned blue as he pointed to his brothers and sisters. "You are all liars. I didn't lie to you." Princess Shaoning moved a small stool and sat down next to the ice mirror. "If you hadn't reminded me, I would have forgotten that teacher left me homework before he left. But it's not difficult, I finished it all in 2 hours." "Li Xiang, what about you?" Princess Shaoning was someone he couldn't afford to offend. Li Han didn't dare to say anything in front of her, so he turned to look at another prince and said. Prince Fu, Li Xiang, was younger than Li Han, and his body was thinner. At this time, he was squinting his eyes, leaning against the ice mirror with a look of enjoyment on his face. When he heard Prince Jin's question, he innocently said, "I didn't write anything, I just copied Princess Shawning's work." "Who asked elder brother to come later than teacher?" "That's right. We all copied Princess Shawning's work. Elder brother, if only you came a quarter of an hour earlier." The princes and princesses joined forces and said. Prince Jin's face was twisted. If he knew that the Bowen Palace was so cool, he would have run here long ago. But even if he came an hour earlier, it would be of no use, because that thing had already been torn to pieces by him. How could he copy? Fortunately, he had used the excuse of lost homework in textbooks to deceive the teacher. Unexpectedly, teacher did not get angry, nor did he make things difficult for him, which made Prince Jean feel a little comforted. This time, Princess Shawning's homework is very good. Prince Fu, Prince Shou, Princess Anyang, Princess Qingyang, in view of this being the first time, there will be no investigation. If you copy other people's homework in the future, you will get 0 points, Your Royal Highness Prince Jean. Li Yi looked at Prince Jean, Li Han, and said, losing homework is not an excuse, 0 points. 0 points. Hearing this sentence, there was a thunderous sound in Li Han's mind. Revenge, this was definitely revenge. Li Xiang and the others were plagiarizing, and they did not rely on their own abilities. He had merely, accidentally lost it. Why did they only give him a 0? Li Han's heart was filled with fear when he thought of his name appearing on the wall outside the Bowen Hall. Although he was a brat who wasn't even 10 years old and didn't know what self-respect was, he knew that if news of this got out, he would definitely become a joke in the palace. He started to feel regret. He shouldn't have provoked Yongning back then. At this moment, in Li Han's eyes, that gentle and weak little girl was like big sister, Princess Shoning. Both of them were labeled as not to be trifled with. It was impossible for the naughty brats to concentrate for a long time. 2 hours later, Li Yi walked out of the Bowen Hall. Thump. Prince Jean, Li Han, knelt on the ground and hugged one of Princess Shoning's legs. With snot and tears, he said, Imperial sister, you must help me. In the end, he still got a chance, which was to make up for all the homework before tomorrow's class. He didn't even have a textbook. If he couldn't find anyone to help him, he would really become a disgrace among the princes. But, I have to go out of the palace with Imperial sister to play today. Princess Shoning looked hesitant. It wasn't easy for her to beg Imperial sister to take her out of the palace. If she helped Li Han familiarize himself with his homework, she could only stay in the palace. Seeing Princess Shoning's hesitation, Li Han immediately said, Imperial father gave Imperial mother a few night Emingzu last time. I'll go ask Imperial mother, and when I get it, I'll immediately give it to you. Girls always couldn't resist the temptation of those shiny things. Thinking that she still needed a few night Emingzu decorations in her room, so that it wouldn't be too dark at night, Princess Shoning was even more moved. After thinking for a long time, she nodded and reached out a hand to Li Han, saying, at least 5. Be careful, move it. Li Yi stood at the entrance of a palace and pointed at the guards who were moving a square foot of ice into the palace. Princess Yongning stood at the entrance of the palace and stared blankly at the scene in front of her. Several palace maids and eunuchs immediately put the ice into the ice mirror. In such hot weather, if they didn't store it as soon as possible, it wouldn't take long for the ice to melt. Li Yi only recently learned about the ice mirror. It was a huge bronze container that looked like a giant cauldron. In the summer, it could be used as a refrigerator or an air conditioner. It was very convenient to use. Li Xian said that the hidden ice in the palace was almost used up. He definitely wouldn't be so extravagant as to let all the princes and princesses waste ice like this. Everyone's share was pitifully small. Even so, the young lady still gave him the only small piece of ice she had. These were Li Yi's rewards. With these ice cubes, she should be much more comfortable in the palace. As for the old emperor and his concubines, who cared? Even if he moved all the ice in the house, it wouldn't be enough for them. It was better to let them find a way themselves. All right, I have to go. I'll see you tomorrow. Seeing that they had moved all the ice cubes, Li Yi waved at Yongning and turned to walk out of the palace. He actually didn't have any porridge to eat today, so he was still hungry. When he passed by the dining hall, he habitually went in and took 2 cucumbers. Everything went smoothly these 2 days. Even Mississippi Lou admitted her mistake for the first time. Although the process was a little complicated, the long Cold War was finally over. The weather that could kill people in the past few days did not seem to be because the emperor's immorality had incurred the wrath of the heavens. A sudden heavy rain took away the heat, as well as many rumors and slanders. Even the layer of haze that shrouded the capital seemed to have been washed away by the rain. The emperor's health improved. The morning court resumed and the court gradually returned to peace and order. However, the few shops in the capital named Rui Workshop weren't peaceful. The weather wasn't as hot as it was a few days ago, but it was still midsummer. Almost all the commoners in the capital loved the mung bean smoothie produced by Rui Workshop. Those with a bit of status felt that a bowl of smoothie that cost 10 copper coins was not worthy of their status. They loved iced grape wine. They didn't mind even if they had to pay 20% more for it. The few newly opened ice-making workshops were also booming. Even though each household could only buy a limited amount, the orders were still queued up for 7 days. Even Fong and the others were so busy that they couldn't go home every day. Li Yi, on the other hand, had nothing to do. He flipped through the gift list in his hands. These were all gifts from the imperial physicians who came to visit. He only sat at home for a quarter of an hour, but he brought half a cart full of gifts. He even kept saying that it was a small gift, and hoped that the owner wouldn't mind. They were all people who understood etiquette. He sent some top-notch medicinal herbs to the old madam. The old madam might need them. This pair of jade bracelets could be given to Duanwu. He saw her staring at the bracelets on Rui's wrist in a daze. As for Mississippi Lu and Xiao Huan, they had already picked out the ones they liked on the day the gifts were delivered. This phoenix hairpin was small and exquisite. It should be very beautiful on Yongning's head. When Li Yi put away the phoenix hairpin, in the palace, that thin figure was sitting in front of the corridor, looking forward to the arrival of a new day. In another palace, a concubine looked at her son who was crying and rolling on the ground. She waved her hand helplessly. All right. Don't cry. It's just a few night Emingzu pills. I'll give them to you, okay? Chapter 430. Everyone has done a good job in the past few days. As a reward, you can rest for 2 days. In the Bowen Hall, as soon as Li Yi's voice fell, the princes and princesses cheered excitedly. They had long been tired of 5 consecutive days of mathematics lessons. When they thought about having 2 days of free time, they naturally couldn't help but be overjoyed. Your Highness Prince Jean, don't forget to memorize the multiplication formula in these 2 days. When Li Yi walked out of the hall, he reminded Prince Jean again. Although Prince Jean was a little stubborn, he had a good comprehension ability. He was a good seedling and was worthy of being cultivated. After a while, Li Han walked out of the hall with a dejected look on his face. It formed a sharp contrast with the other cheering princes and princesses. While the other siblings were still learning about the plus and dash, he had already left them far behind. The plus was actually a new symbol when it was tilted, and it took him 2 whole days to understand the meaning of the symbol. He completed the homework that belonged to him and offset the sin of not completing the homework last time. On the honor roll at the entrance of the Bowen Hall, there were already 5 little red flowers behind royal sister Shanning's name. He didn't even have one. He couldn't waste these 2 days. If he memorized the multiplication formula, he would get 2 little red flowers and jump to the top 5 of the honor roll. Prince Jean gritted his teeth and looked at his brothers and sisters who were running around like wild horses. He silently turned around and walked back to the Bowen Hall. Because of the several new ice-making workshops in the capital, the ice source in the palace wasn't in short supply. However, the ice-making workshops had a limited amount of ice. In addition to supplying the palace, they also had to deal with the nobles in the capital. Therefore, in the palace, although the princes and concubines were given more ice every day, it was still far from enough. Of course, that was except for Princess Yongning. Every day, Li Yi would send someone to deliver a large amount of ice before noon. Then, after class, he would go to Yongning's place to sit for a while and talk to her. Of course, he was talking to himself. Even though he could feel her joy, he never heard her speak. This made Li Yi a little depressed. Well, it's getting late. I have to go. I won't come to the palace tomorrow or the day after. I won't see you until the day after. Li Yi gently touched her head, stood up, and walked out of the palace. When he passed by the Bowen Hall, he saw Shanning and the 2 little princesses playing in the shade. When she saw him, she seemed a little angry and didn't even say hello. In the past few days, Li Yi also felt that there was something wrong with her in class. He didn't know what happened to this black-bellied lowly. After thinking about it carefully, he found that he really did not provoke her, so he put this matter to the back of his mind. Humph. Before he took 2 steps, a cold snort suddenly came from behind. Li Yi turned around and saw Princess Shining following behind him with her hands behind her back. She kicked her little steps and pouted. She stared at him fiercely with her big eyes. This little tiger look had never been seen since Li Yi became her mathematics teacher. Li Yi looked back at her and asked, "What's wrong? Who provoked the noble princess?" "You." The two-faced loli glared at him and said bitterly. "Me?" Li Yi pointed to himself and then looked at Princess Shining. He made hot pot for her, taught her how to cook, and even gave her a little red flower. Although she was young, did she have a conscience to say such words? "It's you." The arrogant loli pointed at him and showed her 2 tiger teeth. She didn't look fierce, but she was very cute. "What's wrong with me?" Seeing her appearance, Li Yi was even more surprised. "You send so many ice cubes to Yongning every day and cook delicious food for her. Do you know that I can't sleep because of the heat at night?" Princess Shining looked at Li Yi and said with some grievance. Tears even began to flash in her big eyes. A few days ago, she saw that teacher send a lot of ice cubes to Yongning's palace. It was more than the ice cubes that father gave them every day. It was so much that Yongning didn't feel hot when she slept at night. However, she was also very hot. Imperial father had given her and imperial mother 2 little ice. It was impossible for them to last until night. Every night, she would toss and turn in the heat, finding it hard to sleep. She thought that since her teacher had already given Yongning so much ice, it should be her turn next. She knew teacher earlier than Yongning. Although at that time, she thought he was a bad guy who snatched food from her, didn't she change her impression later, but the next day, teacher only sent Yongning ice cubes. She thought it would be the 3rd day, the 4th day, then, there was no then. She felt a little aggrieved and sad. She knew teacher first, and shouldn't she be the one that teacher liked the most? She was like a child who lost the love of her elders. She felt very sad. She even wanted to ask teacher personally if he liked Yongning more than him. Looking at the arrogant Lolita's big eyes that were covered with a layer of mist, even Li Yi was a little stunned. Could it be that she was jealous? To be honest, among these little princesses and princes, other than Yongning, he liked Princess Shining the most. Although she looked arrogant on the surface, she was obedient and sensible on the inside. As for Yongning, she always had a special aura that attracted him to get close to her. Perhaps it was because the young lady's tragic life had aroused his compassion, or perhaps it was because it evoked some similar memories deep in his heart, which triggered something similar to the desire to protect her, but he didn't expect that these actions, in the eyes of Princess Shining, represented another meaning. The young lady's heart was actually so sensitive. Li Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He said, okay. Don't cry first. I'll get them to send ice when I get back. You can send someone to the palace gate to receive it later. At first, Li Yi felt that with so many people in the palace, he couldn't afford to offend any of the concubines. It would be a big problem for him to choose who to send. So, other than Yongning, he didn't send anyone else and let them buy it from the ice-making workshop. But seeing the arrogant Lolita who was about to cry, he had to change his mind. Concubine Yen was with her, so he only needed to send one. Mingzu probably wouldn't be lacking either. If he sent one to her daughter, he would have to send one to her mother. The empress would also get one. Concubine Shui was the king of Shu's mother, so she would be better off. As for the others, he wasn't familiar with them. Who wants it? The arrogant Lolita snorted angrily. She glared at Li Yi and ran away. Li Yi looked at her cheerful steps and thought to himself, although she said she didn't want it, if he didn't send it, the next time they met, she would immediately become a little tiger again. These days, Lolitas were fierce. Chapter 431. A mountain couldn't accommodate 2 tigers, but a palace could accommodate 2 little Lolas. Since Princess Shining didn't have insomnia at night, even her temper became much better. She changed from a fierce little tiger to a docile little tiger. Occasionally, when Yongning was in a daze, she would sit next to her and watch her for a while. Li Yi now deeply understood what it meant to not worry about scarcity but to worry about inequality. Even sisters would be jealous. Fortunately, his family was much more stable. Rui had always been indifferent and never cared about these things. If Mississippi Lu liked something, she would always do it herself. Why would she be jealous in secret? The arrogant Lolis's anger finally subsided. She wouldn't snort at him for no reason. Monarch Jean, on the other hand, looked a little haggard these 2 days. He just had a shallow understanding of multiplication and division, and the problem of when Li Lei would catch up with Han Mimi made him feel like dying. He secretly flipped through the exclusive booklet that the teacher gave him. At the end, there was even the problem of a pervert putting a chicken and a rabbit in the same cage and counting their legs. Poor Monarch Jean felt as if he had fallen into a bottomless quagmire, and he was sinking deeper and deeper, unable to climb out. On the wall outside Bowen Hall, the 4 little red flowers behind his name had become the most gorgeous color in Monarch Jin's eyes. Can you not always wander in front of me if you have nothing to do? Is it very idle to be a supervisor? Li Yi looked at Li Xian, who was walking around in the room, rubbed his eyebrows, and said angrily. Just now, when the little servant girl massaged his shoulders, he almost fell asleep. In the end, his dream was still disturbed by Li Xian. Li Xian said while pacing, recently, I have encountered a few problems. Help me think of a solution. I will tell you a way. In the future, if you have any problems, you don't need to ask me anymore. It seemed that he couldn't sleep anymore, so Li Yi stood up from the rocking chair and said. What is it? Li Xian looked at him expectantly. Li Yi looked at him and said, write down the problems you encounter and paste them on the walls of Jingdo wherever there are many people. If you don't know where there are many people, go to the Ministry of Justice and ask. Wherever they usually put up the wanted posters, paste them there. Will this work? Li Xian had a doubtful expression on his face. You'll know once you try. Li Yi looked at him, believe me, if you can put up a reward of 10 taels of silver, your efficiency will increase by several times. Li Xian had encountered several technical difficulties in his research. Li Yi could provide him with theoretical support, but many aspects of this era were too backward. Even the cleverest housewife can't cook without rice, so many of his ideas could only temporarily stay at the level of ideas. Once these difficulties were overcome, Li Xian would have nothing to do for a long time. After the dream of flying in the sky was realized, the next step was to go to the moon. The possibility of the dream of all mankind being realized in Li Xian's hands was not high. Li Yi was not particularly concerned about whether Li Xian could find folk masters or not. He still had a lot of things to do. In a 5-star restaurant in Jingdo, Li Yi sat by the window on the 2nd floor of a seat on the window. He poured a cup of tea and listened to the sound of musical instruments coming from downstairs. Old Sun was reporting something to him. Miss Wan sent a letter yesterday, saying that she might have to stay in Qing and Prefecture for a while. The business of the brothels in Jingdo is very good, but we don't have enough people. Maybe because we're new here, the performers here don't trust us very much. At the beginning, there were some local ruffians who caused trouble, but they were all taken care of by us and didn't cause much impact, don't worry. Have a cup of tea and talk slowly. Li Yi also poured a cup of tea for Old Sun and handed it to him. In reality, the development of the brothels in Jingdo was not as smooth as imagined. There were many obstacles. Fortunately, Old Sun and the others were able to overcome them one by one. At the beginning, they went to Jingdo alone and couldn't even find a place to stay. Now, they gradually gained a foothold. Even with Li Yi's help, it was not easy. Next to Old Sun, a thin middle-aged man coughed lightly and said, the main thing is that we don't have enough people. Most of them stayed in Qing and Prefecture. If we want to develop enough people in Jingdo, we can't do it in a short period of time. Li Yi looked at him and asked with a smile, are you feeling better today? Thanks to Sir, I'm fine now, the middle-aged man called Lu Luo said with a smile. Li Yi glanced at the man beside him who only cared about eating and then looked at the middle-aged man opposite him. He still had reservations about whether or not the two were really brothers. The man who was eating heartily was called Lu Mang. Just like his name, he was the one who wanted to rob them that day, but in the end, he was humiliated by Miss Lu. The middle-aged man in front of him was his older brother, Lu Luo. At that time, Lu Luo was seriously injured. The reason why the middle-aged man wanted to rob them was to treat his brother's illness. Although Lu Luo's appearance was ordinary, he was very capable. He worked in the brothels and in a short period of time, he managed to take care of everything related to the ranking list of the Martial Arts Society. This time, Old Sun specially brought him along when he came to Jingdo. A while ago, Li Yi specially asked Imperial Physician Lu to take a look at him. The skills of the director of the Royal Academy of Medicine were not just for show. He pointed out a few old injuries in his body, and after a few acupuncture treatments, he was more or less healed. There's no rush with the matter of the brothels. Let's take it one step at a time. As Li Yi and Old Sun were talking, two figures came up from downstairs. The one in front was an old man in ragged clothes. A plainly dressed young girl carrying a guzheng followed behind him. "Sir, do a good deed and give us a few copper coins." The old man held a gong in his hand and walked around the tables upstairs in front of the customers. Only a middle-aged man threw 2 copper coins into the gong. The others waved their hands as if they were shooing away flies. "You were the ones playing just now, right? Not bad. The young girl already has some skills." Old Sun stood up and walked over. He took out a piece of silver and put it into the gong in the old man's hand. Then, he walked back and sat down. Li Yi knew that Old Sun had a great compassion for performers, especially these kind of wandering performers. He also took out a few pieces of silver and put it in. "Thank you, sir, thank you, sir." The old man didn't expect these 2 customers to be so generous. The silver added up was probably more than 1 tael. It was equivalent to half a month's harvest. He bowed and said, "What song does sir want to listen to? Do you want my daughter to play a song for you?" The old man looked at Li Yi and asked. Li Yi saw the young girl biting her lower lip with a timid expression. He smiled and said, "Then play a song. Just play what you are best at." "Then play, Shui Diao Getu." The old man immediately said to the young girl. "Shui Diao Getu?" Hearing this, Li Yi paused for a moment. Then, he smiled and nodded. He said, "Then play, Shui Diao Getu." Shui Diao Getu was the name of a poem. Since it was a poem, it naturally had a song and lyrics. The young girl nodded slightly. Her fingers lightly plucked and a soft sound came out. After a prelude, she opened her mouth and sang in a small voice, "When will the moon be clear? Holding a cup of wine, I ask the blue sky." Not far behind the young girl, in a room, a few young people were exchanging cups. In the corner, a young man who had been silent for a long time suddenly raised his head and asked, "What is that sound?" The people at the table immediately froze. One of them closed his eyes and listened carefully for a moment before smiling and saying, "It's the tune of Shui Diao Getu." Ever since Li Yi's poems from Qing and Fu spread to the capital, it can often be heard. Halfway through the person's words, he suddenly realized that the people beside him were giving him looks. In a shock, he immediately thought of something. The name Li Yi was a taboo among them. He looked at the young man in the corner and his face immediately paled. Li Yi was not very well versed in the way of music. At most, he only felt that the young girl played very well. When he heard her sing, "People have joys and sorrows, the moon waxes and wanes," the door to a room in the back suddenly opened. A young man angrily walked out of the room and pointed at the young girl. He said, "What are you playing to disturb my mood? Get out of here." Chapter 432. The old man and the young girl relied on singing and playing for a living. There were many restaurants in the capital, and there were always some kind-hearted shopkeepers who wouldn't chase them away. After they finished playing, they would ask for a few copper coins with a straight face. In rare cases, there would be customers who directly asked for more money. Of course, there were also many cases of being despised by others. The old man walked over with a smile and said, "My daughter's skills are not good enough and have disturbed young master's peace. I am truly sorry. This old man will leave immediately. Hurry up and get lost." The young man glared at the old man with disgust. Just as he was about to walk back in, he suddenly heard a bang sound from the front. A man suddenly stood up. In the eyes of the man named Lu Mang, old son and his benefactor had paid, so of course they wanted to listen to the end of the song. In reality, he was also listening with great interest, but he didn't know that this guy who came out of nowhere was so rude. It was a total spoil of fun. He looked down on rude people the most in his life. Lu Mang slammed the table and stood up. He walked to the side of the old man and looked at the young man and said, "So many people haven't said anything. What right do you have to tell them to get lost? I'm eating here for peace and quiet. What is she playing? She ruined my mood to drink. This is a restaurant, not a place to sing." Seeing the fierce man standing in front of him, the young man's momentum couldn't help but weaken a little. "Come back." Lu Mang originally wanted to argue with the young man a bit more, but hearing his big brother's voice, he could only lower his head and walk back. "Sir, I am truly sorry." Before the song finished, the old man walked over with an apologetic face. Li Yi waved his hand, not minding. Playing in a restaurant would indeed disturb others. Although the young man's words were a bit excessive, they were reasonable. The old man hurriedly thanked him and packed up with the young girl, preparing to go downstairs. At this time, at the entrance of the stairs, from the room that the young man had just entered, a few figures walked out. They were all dressed in luxurious clothes. One look and it was obvious that they weren't ordinary people. The old man and the young girl hurriedly made way for them. The gong in their hands accidentally fell to the ground with a clang. The copper coins scattered all over the floor. The old man hurriedly bent down to pick them up. "Out of the way." The old man squatted down and blocked the way of those people. One of the young men kicked his shoulder and pushed him to the side. Then, he turned to a man in the crowd and said, "Young Master Qin, please." "Father." The girl hurriedly ran over and helped the old man up. Although there were quite a few people upstairs who saw this scene, their faces revealed a slightly strange expression, but no one dared to stand out and say anything. There were a few famous hedonistic young masters in the capital, and none of them were people they could afford to offend. The old man blocking their way was kicked away. Just as they were about to go downstairs, a voice suddenly came from behind them. "Out of the way." A man used his arm to push them aside, turned around and said to the person behind him, "Benefactor, please." At this time, the difference in size was completely revealed. The young masters didn't have any strength to resist and were easily pushed aside by the man with just one arm. Caught off guard, two of them even fell on their butts. This sudden scene made the people upstairs open their mouths. They didn't know where this big man came from, but he was actually so daring. Wasn't this clearly showing that he couldn't get along with this group of hedonistic young masters and young Duke Qin? "Bastard! Who are you? Do you want to die?" The two young men climbed up from the ground and glared at the big man. Someone shouted downstairs, and immediately there was a burst of hurried footsteps coming from the stairs. Qin Yu held on to the handrail of the stairs to prevent himself from falling. When he looked at the big man, his gaze suddenly froze and he looked behind the big man. How could it be him? The two people beside Qin Yu also saw him. They turned their heads and looked at Qin Yu with surprise on their faces. Of course, Li Yi also saw Qin Yu. He hadn't seen him for more than 4 months, and this young Duke Qin was still as elegant as before. His complexion was much better than the last time he saw him, and his body had actually gained some weight. It could be seen that he had been living very comfortably in the capital city these past few months. "Li Xianzi, long time no see." Qin Yu walked out from the crowd and looked at Li Yi with a smile on his face. Li Xianzi. The few hedonistic young masters behind Qin Yu were still curious about what young Duke Qin wanted to do. At this moment, when they heard this name coming from his mouth, they were stunned for a moment and then immediately widened their eyes. Li Xianzi. This name and address had long been well known to them. Not to mention the various rumors about himself, he had a good personal relationship with the crown prince and the princess, had defeated the monk of the Qi kingdom in the discussion of Zen at the Cold Mountain Temple, had excellent poetry and was extremely talented. Of course, they knew all of this. However, the reason why he really entered the public's eyes and made so many people remember him was because of other things. He had wreaked havoc in the King of Shu's residence and almost killed little Duke Qin, causing the King of Shu to lose all face. Yet, he was still able to walk out of the King of Shu's residence in such a swaggering manner. Of course, this was not all. In just one day, he sent little Duke Qin flying with a slap in the palace, causing him to not even be able to attend His Majesty's invitation. He didn't give face to the King of Shu and the Qin's mansion. What was the result? In the end, Li Xianzi was still Li Xianzi, but young Duke Qin was grounded at home by Prime Minister Qin for half a year. It was only a few days ago that he was released 2 months earlier. They didn't know if anyone else could do this. At least, they couldn't do it. Therefore, they were very vigilant about the name Li Yi. Everyone couldn't help but look over. Li Xianzi, who was rumored to have a death feud with young Duke Qin, was the person opposite them. This was really fate. The two hedonistic young masters hurriedly waved their hands at the guards going up the stairs, signaling them not to act rashly. Long time no see. Li Yi also smiled and cupped his hands at Qin Yu. He pointed to the stairs and said, "Young Duke Qin, aren't you leaving?" Li Xianzi, please. The smile on Qin Yu's face hadn't disappeared, and he made a please gesture. Young Duke Qin, you're welcome. Although Li Yi said it politely, he had already walked in the direction of the stairs. Old Sun and the LV brothers naturally followed him, and the old man and the young girl also followed closely behind them. Many people upstairs who didn't know what was going on knew Qin Yu, but they didn't know the young man. They were very curious about his identity and why young Duke Qin was so polite to him. The young people around Qin Yu were somewhat surprised and puzzled by the scene in front of them. There was clearly an irreconcilable death feud between the two, but they could still be so calm when they met. Thinking about it carefully, they even felt a little scared. The sound on the stairs gradually disappeared, and the smile on Qin Yu's face gradually disappeared. No one could see his expression clearly. The atmosphere was strangely quiet. Even the famous hedonistic young masters around Qin Yu felt a chill run down their backs and didn't dare to breathe too loudly. Let's go. After an unknown amount of time, Qin Yu suddenly opened his mouth and took the lead to walk down the stairs. Everyone immediately let out a sigh of relief in their hearts. They looked at each other and hurriedly followed. Sir, those people are. Old Sun stood on the street and watched the figures of the group disappear. He turned his head to look at Li Yi and asked in confusion. Young Duke Qin. Lu Luo pondered over the words he heard upstairs and raised his head to look in a certain direction thoughtfully. Chapter 433. Big brother, if you hadn't stopped me, I would have taught them a lesson. Once Qin Yu and the others had completely disappeared, the man named Lu Mang spat out these words with hatred. Shut up, this is the capital, not Qing and prefecture. You'd better change your impulsive personality, or else who knows what kind of trouble you'll cause in the future. Lu Luo glared at him. Just now when they were upstairs, they had heard those people whispering to each other. Those young people all had extraordinary backgrounds, and one of them was even the grandson of the Minister of the Right. How could these two brothers afford to offend such people? Although Lu Mang's brain wasn't that good, he always listened to his big brother Lu Luo's words. Hearing this, he could only shut his mouth in embarrassment. Young Duke Qin, Qin Manor, Minister Qin. As these words floated in Lu Luo's mind, the old man holding the gong was whispering to Old Man Sunday. Not long after, the old man's face lit up, and after getting confirmation from Old Man's son, he happily turned his head and said something to the young girl. As Li Yi walked back home, Qin Yu's strange smile still occasionally appeared in his mind. The conflict between the two had long been irreconcilable. Whether it was threatening, ignoring, or even fighting. These were all normal reactions. But Qin Yu was so calm, so unnaturally calm. Li Yi didn't think that it was because Qin Yu had thought about life in the past few months and suddenly felt that he had been a beast for the first half of his life, so he decided to turn over a new leaf and become a law-abiding citizen. This was impossible. He really couldn't understand Qin Yu's behavior. Could it be that he had encountered a maniac with multiple personalities? When Li Yi returned home, Rui and the old madam were talking in the courtyard. When she walked over, the two of them simultaneously shut their mouths. Li Yi was surprised. Was there something they couldn't let him hear? In the shade under the tree, second granduncle was lying on a rocking chair, snoring softly. Li Yi thought about it and was surprised to find that second granduncle usually slept more than he was awake. He did not know where the old man got so much sleep on a daily basis. Li Yi could not do it himself. If he slept too long, his head would hurt. Was it because his martial arts was not as good as second granduncle's? Other than him and second uncle, almost everyone else was busy. Unknowingly, there were a lot of businesses in the family. The Rui workshop, the ice-making workshop, the smoothie shop, and the brothel that was still in its infancy. All of these required people. The habit of not trusting others might have been formed when they were in the Willow Leaf Village. Lao Fong and the others would do anything related to money on their own. For things like making ice, they would always keep an eye on it and not let other people interfere. The busier they were, the more excited they were. Li Yi noticed that Mrs. Fong's face was always glowing these days, especially after Zhuzi was put in charge of a shop in the city and only returned home once every few days. Mississippi Lu seemed to have nothing to do recently. There was no Wulin hero ranking in the capital, so naturally, there wouldn't be a chance for her to find someone to practice with. Bored, she sat in the courtyard and wiped her eyes with liquor. When Li Yi came in, she looked up and glanced at him, then went on with her own business. Li Xian walked in circles on the ground while looking at Li Yi, who was lying in the rocking chair and reading. Solved? Li Yi asked casually. It's done. Li Xian stopped in his tracks and nodded. He couldn't hide the surprise in his eyes. He finally couldn't help but ask, You? How did you know? Remember the saying, the experts are among the people. Li Yi stood up and put down the book, then patted Li Xian's shoulder and said. What Li Xian was doing now didn't have much technical content. In fact, with the scientific level of the Jing Kingdom and even the current world, there wasn't much technical content. The so-called high-end talents were only so-so, and even far from some of the enthusiasts among the people. The power of the people was infinite. Mobilizing the power of the whole capital was definitely much better than a few people racking their brains together. The experts are among the people. Before today, Li Xian would definitely scoff at the person who said this, but it turned out that Li Yi was right. Thinking of the problem that had been bothering him for a long time, and then thinking of the honest, bare-chested, uneducated carpenter outside the capital, his handsome face couldn't help but feel a little hot. The dignified crown prince, who had received the orthodox education of the royal family since childhood, was not even as good as an uneducated carpenter. How shameful. The problem that troubled him so much that he couldn't eat or sleep was actually only worth 10 taels of silver, and it was easily solved by a carpenter. Li Xian even wondered what the point of doing this was. More importantly, this was a wonderful method. Why didn't he think of it before? Was the gap between him and Li Yi really so big? Li Yi casually threw him a washed pear that was soaked in ice water and said, You came to say this? Li Xian took a bite of the pear, and his face became slightly serious. He said, I came to tell you that Qin Yu is out. You're out? Li Yi didn't know what he meant by that. Li Xian explained, after you left the capital, Qin Yu was grounded by Prime Minister Qin for half a year. He didn't step out of the Qin's mansion until a few days ago. Li Yi didn't know that there was such a thing. He was stunned for a moment and said, I know. I just saw him today. Today? Li Xian looked at him in surprise and asked, Where? After a while, Li Xian, who understood the whole story, frowned and said, How is that possible? This doesn't seem like Madman Qin's character. What's Madman Qin's character like? He doesn't return favors and takes revenge. He won't suffer losses, Li Xian said seriously. Then he shook his head and said, but it's also possible that Prime Minister Qin increased the restrictions on him. After all, the Qin family's decades of reputation can't be ruined by Qin Yu alone. Moreover, Prime Minister Qin has been urging Uncle Huang to support the King of Shu as the crown prince these days. All the officials in the court who disagree with him are watching him. It's impossible for Qin Yu to cause any trouble and be caught. Support the King of Shu as the crown prince? Yes. The ancestral rule of the Li family is to pass it on to the elder and not the younger. Prime Minister Qin is a veteran of 3 dynasties and has always been a supporter of the King of Shu. The King of Shu can't get to where he is today without the support of Prime Minister Qin. Li Xian finished the pear in a few bites and said, during the time you were not in Jingdo, many things happened. Uncle Huang's health is unwell, and the discipline of the court is not strong. Prime Minister Qin and many other officials have repeatedly remonstrated with Uncle Huang, wanting to appoint a crown prince to oversee the country. Although Uncle Huang's health has improved, there have been even more voices in court wanting to appoint a crown prince. Li Yi could understand what Prime Minister Qin and the others were doing. After all, the country couldn't be without a ruler. If the old emperor was in the prime of his life, healthy, able to eat 5 bowls of rice a day and communicate with his concubines at night, who would mention the idea of appointing a crown prince? But now the emperor was seriously ill and no one knew when he would follow the late emperor into death. Under such circumstances, what were they waiting for instead of appointing a crown prince? If the emperor suddenly passed away, the position of the East Palace would be vacant and the court would be unstable. Without a new emperor to stabilize the court, the Jing kingdom would definitely fall into chaos. This was what all the officials wanted to see. From the perspective of a small landlord in the capital of the Jing kingdom, Li Yi would certainly support the appointment of a crown prince in order to live a few more days of peace. But the problem was, the King of Shu was really annoying. Becoming enemies with the future emperor was not something to be happy about. Li Xian didn't need to worry too much. Even if the King of Shu became the emperor, he wouldn't easily touch him. But it was different for him. Li Yi was sure that if the King of Shu ascended to the throne, not only would he not have a good life, he might even have no days to live. Chapter 434. Although Prime Minister Qin is a little pedantic, he never loses his righteousness. If Qin Yu is alone, without the power of Qin's mansion, we don't have to worry too much. Looking at Li Xian's seemingly reasonable analysis, Li Yi couldn't help but ask, what about the King of Shu? What about the King of Shu? Li Xian asked doubtfully. If the King of Shu becomes the emperor, what will you do? Li Xian thought of the King of Shu and the current emperor at the same time. He hesitated for a while, shook his head and said, I don't think the King of Shu can be the emperor. Li Xian's surname was Li, but his name was not Li Chunfeng. He didn't think that one thing would not affect the other thing at all. Li Yi thought that he couldn't gamble with the future of the Li family and the Viscount's mansion with the King of Shu's generosity. It was time to make some long-term plans. Well, that's all for today. From tomorrow on, you don't have to come every day. I'll ask Princess Shaning to inform you of the specific time of the class. Li Yi stood in front of them and clapped his hands. The princes and princesses immediately dispersed. 2 hours a day could teach a lot of content. Now, these princes and princesses only needed to attend the math class. It wouldn't take long for them to grow from first graders to second graders. Li Yi felt that it was enough for them to learn up to this level. As for the deeper things, they would never need them for the rest of their lives anyway. The standard of not making mistakes when buying groceries was enough for them to use for the rest of their lives if they needed to buy their own groceries. My brother, what are you writing? Seeing that the teacher had left and Monarch Jean was still lying on the table biting the tip of his pen, a young prince ran over and asked in confusion. Shoo, don't disturb me. I'm doing math. Monarch Jean waved his hand as if shooing away a fly and continued to frown. Oh. The young prince nodded and looked at the paper on the table. My brother, you're a liar. Suddenly, as if discovering something, the young prince frowned and pointed at Monarch Jean. How did I lie to you? Monarch Jean glared at him and said, Go away, don't make trouble for me. Go play somewhere else. You're a liar. The little prince pointed at the strange symbols on the paper and said, You didn't even write a number. This is not mathematics. Hearing this, Prince Jean was stunned. He looked down at the A, B, X, and Y on the paper and sighed deeply. He touched the little prince's head and took out a booklet from under the table. He said, Xiaowen, you are still too young to understand the horror of arithmetic. Come on, let me broaden your horizons. Not long after, a certain youth walked out of the Bowen Hall with a dumbfounded expression. He stood at the entrance in a daze, his face filled with deep bewilderment. Just now, under the guidance of his imperial brother, Prince Jean, his life had undergone an inhumane subversion. Why put chickens and rabbits in the same cage? Why count their heads and feet? Isn't it boring? Have you ever considered the feelings of the chicken and rabbit? Also, why does Li Lei pursue Han Mimi? How long will it take for Li Lei to catch up with Han Mimi? How dare he molest an innocent woman? Li Lei, come out now. I'll ask the guards to break your legs. What's more, why did he pour and scoop water for the Dragon Phoenix pond? Why did he ask how long it would take for the pond to be empty? Water is very precious. A few days ago, during the drought, his imperial father warned them to save water because there were still many people who didn't have water to drink. If anyone dared to scoop up the water in the Dragon Phoenix pond, his imperial father would definitely punish them. The weather outside was a little hot, but the youth didn't feel hot at all. After shivering, he no longer felt that the mathematics he was learning was very difficult. He looked into the hall with some pity, then quickly ran away, just as Prince Jean was scratching his ears and cheeks and sweating because of a difficult problem. In the cool morning dew hall, Princess Shining grabbed the last piece of meat roll with her nimble hands. She proudly raised her chin at Li Yi, dipped it in the sauce that Li Yi had personally made in the jade bowl, and quickly stuffed it into her mouth. Among all the palaces in the entire imperial palace, there were only 3 that were so cool, except for the old emperor's residence. Princess Yongning's palace, Consort Yan's, Shaning's mother, palace, and the last one was Princess Emingzu Royal's morning dew hall. After class, Li Yi was dragged here by Princess Shaning. The reason was that the hot pot base made by the imperial chefs in the palace was not as authentic as his. Is there anything new in the imperial court recently? Li Yi put some vegetables into the pot and asked casually. Emingzu raised her head and looked at him in surprise. Didn't he always have no interest in these things? She was only slightly surprised for a moment, then she said, What do you mean? Just say something. Emingzu thought for a while and said, It's not a big deal. These days, the most discussed topic in the imperial court is that the Qi kingdom has promised great benefits. They want to exchange a large amount of wealth for the 2 cities that we have occupied. The imperial court is divided into 2 factions. Some people think that the Qi kingdom is too powerful. Although we had the upper hand last time, it's not appropriate for us to continue to be enemies. If the Qi kingdom wants to exchange salt, iron, and warhorses, it's not impossible to consider it. The other faction thinks that the 2 cities are already part of our territory, so they don't agree to the exchange. She looked up at Li Yi and asked, What do you think? Li Yi didn't want to change his name to Li Yuanfang. He quickly reached out and grabbed the last piece of tofu in the pot before Princess Shaning and put it in his own bowl. Then he said, What else can I think? Let's eat and think. How dare you eat my tofu? Princess Shaning pretended to be angry and glared at Li Yi. What do you mean by, your tofu? It belongs to whoever got it. I put it in just now. It belongs to me. But you ate the meat I put in just now. I don't care. You ate my tofu just now, so the tofu you put in just now belongs to me. Emingzu looked at the 2 people arguing endlessly over a piece of tofu and suddenly felt a headache coming on. Only then did she realize that she had asked a useless question. Ever since the incident with Tian Fa, he had never said much about these things. It would be strange to hear any opinion from him. Li Yi looked at her and asked again, let's not talk about these boring things. What else is there to talk about? And Mingzi knew that the boring things he was talking about were all the affairs of the state. She shook her head and said helplessly, when the envoy of the Qi kingdom was negotiating with my father and the court officials about the two cities, several people who claimed to be scholars of the Qi kingdom suddenly appeared in the capital. In the name of exchanging knowledge, they challenged the great scholars of the Jing kingdom. They involved poetry, scripture, and all kinds of miscellaneous knowledge. What happened in the end? Li Yi was obviously much more interested in this matter. We've lost. Li Mingzhu shook her head and said, we've lost. We've lost completely. Prime Minister Qin lost to a nameless old man in a debate about scripture. In a fit of anger, he fell ill for 3 days. These days, he didn't even bother my father with the matter of naming the crown prince. Great scholar Wang Zhong, who is over 50 years old and is known as the poetry ghost, competed with a young man in poetry. He admitted on the spot that his poetry was inferior. Chess Saint Baiyu played 3 games with that person and lost every game. Upon hearing this, Li Yi was a little stunned. He didn't even realize that his tofu had been eaten by Princess Shaning. Only a few people from the Qi kingdom had come, but they had defeated the most powerful people of the Jing kingdom in their respective fields. This was a slap to the face. Chapter 435. After a rare victory, the morale of both the people and the imperial court of the Jing kingdom was unprecedentedly high, reaching its peak in the past 10 years. Although the move of the Qi kingdom did not cause any substantial damage to the Jing kingdom, it greatly impacted the morale and enthusiasm of the people. Moreover, this was an open and above-board exchange of knowledge. Even if the Jing kingdom lost, they could not take revenge, otherwise, they would really lose face and reputation. This time, the strength of the Qi kingdom also refreshed the understanding of the people. They were just a few nameless soldiers, but they defeated the top existences in all aspects of the Jing kingdom. What kind of background did they have? Of course, as for whether those people were nameless soldiers in the Qi kingdom, they were not the people of the Qi kingdom, so they did not know. Li Yi put a few more pieces of tofu in it. Writing poems or playing chess, if they lost, then they lost. If they were not as skilled as others, then they were not as skilled. What could they do? Moreover, the Jing kingdom had just seized 2 cities from others. How could they not allow others to come and get back at them? It was a pity that they did not see it with their own eyes that day when Prime Minister Qin fell ill from anger after debating with others. Li Yi reached out to pick up his tofu and asked casually, didn't they say that the imperial court is debating about the crown prince? What's the result now? And Mingzhu raised her eyebrows and said, the crown prince has always been a matter of the royal family. Since when did others have the right to tell us what to do? If not for the stability of the imperial court, father has always actively listened to the opinions of the officials and never acted arbitrarily. How could they have today's arrogance? He did not expect Her Highness to have such a domineering side. Li Yi forgot to chew and almost got scalded by the tofu. He could not help but give her a thumbs up and said, I increasingly feel that you have the talent to be an emperor. An emperor who was afraid of the slightest thing and indecisive might be a benevolent ruler, but it was unlikely that he would become a wise ruler. When it was time to be domineering, one should be domineering. Otherwise, what was the point of being an emperor? In this aspect, the old emperor was still lacking, even inferior to Her Highness the eldest princess. Mingzi glanced at him and said, don't talk nonsense. How can there be a woman in this world who can be an emperor? What's wrong with women? Are women born to be dwarfed? Li Yi said as he fought with Princess Shaning for the tofu. Men and women are born equal. Your way of thinking is unacceptable. Princess Shaning agreed with Li Yi's words very much. She nodded her head repeatedly, and the speed of her snatching became faster. In this day and age, saying that beggars and emperors were born equal would be labeled as disrespecting the emperor, but for Her Royal Highness, who had long awakened her feminist consciousness, she never thought that men were nobler than women. This is different. Mingzu looked at him and said, since ancient times until now, which woman, in short, women can't be emperors? Who said that women can't be emperors? Li Yi wondered why this girl was so stubborn. He snatched the last piece of tofu from Princess Shanning's chopsticks and looked up at her. Have you never heard of Wu Zetian? Wu Zetian? Mingzu showed a trace of doubt on her face. After thinking for a moment, she still couldn't remember this name. She asked, who is Wu Zetian? You haven't even heard of Wu Zetian. Li Yi suddenly realized a problem halfway through his sentence. This was a world that was completely different from the one he was familiar with. The former Tang dynasty had only existed for a few decades before it fell apart. The Eternal Emperor didn't even have time to complete his career before he died. What happened after that was very different from the Tang dynasty in the other world. The former Tang dynasty was completely defeated by the next few emperors, and Sister Wu didn't have the chance to show off the elegance of an empress. In the history books that Li Yi read, this name didn't even appear. It's nothing. After realizing this, Li Yi shook his head and said, strange. Mingzu looked at him and picked up her chopsticks. Li Yi and Princess Shanning only saw a flash in front of their eyes. The tofu that they were fighting over just now had run into her bowl. They both rolled their eyes at her, strongly condemning and protesting against this kind of martial arts bullying. After condemning and protesting, they turned their attention to the other things in the pot. After that, the princess didn't say anything. Li Yi thought that she had already forgotten about what just happened. At a certain moment, the princess put down her jade bowl and looked at Li Yi. She asked seriously, who is Wu Zetian? Li Yi suddenly felt that he was about to do something very incredible. Attacking the aristocratic families, developing the imperial examinations, putting the poor in important positions, and starting the era of great governance. Mingzu looked at Li Yi. Can a female empress really achieve this? In reality, as the first female empress in history, the later generations had different opinions about her, but her achievements couldn't be denied. The dawn of China's strongest empire in thousands of years, after Emperor Gao Taizong's heroic founding and Zhenguan's rule, was finally in the hands of Emperor Xianzong and Empress Wu. It was the beginning of a prosperous era, and China had thousands of years of history. From the inside to the outside, the nation was magnificent, looking down on the world, conquering the 4 seas, and was like the sun in the sky. No matter what, as the only female empress in history, she had probably done the best that a woman could do. Mingzhu's pretty face showed a trace of confusion and confusion. She looked at Li Yi and asked, which dynasty and which emperor are you talking about? Why have I never heard of it? I'm just saying. How can there be such a dynasty? Don't tell me you really believe it. Li Yi was stunned for a moment, then he stood up with a smile and said, thank you for your hospitality. I'll go back first. I'll treat you guys next time if there's a chance. Okay. Princess Shanning's little face showed a smile, and she immediately became happy. She ran out while shouting, don't leave in a hurry. Tell me clearly when you'll treat us. Looking at Yong Ning, who was shouting and running out with Li Yi, Mingzu withdrew her gaze and fell into deep thought while facing the fire in front of her. The aristocratic families were flourishing, and they deeply penetrated into the imperial court. In order to get rid of the aristocratic politics, Father had been intentionally putting the poor in important positions for so many years, but it didn't achieve much. The dynasty that Li Yi mentioned just now was no different from the Jing kingdom on this point. However, the great achievements that the previous emperors of the Jing kingdom and the previous dynasties couldn't achieve, how did that woman do it? She knew how she did it. This was because Li Yi had already explained everything in great detail. Wu Zetian, in the 6th month of the 2nd year of Jing He, Princess Royal Highness stood at the door of the Morning Dew Hall and said this name when the warm morning sun jumped out from the top of the palace opposite. Chapter 436. Ideals were often full, but the reality was much crueler and crueler. Wu Zetian was famous not because she was an empress, but because she was the only empress in Huaxia for thousands of years. Honestly speaking, if the princess could imitate her, Li Yi would definitely agree with her. But the problem was that it was useless for him to agree alone. For a woman to proclaim herself as an empress, it was not just the civil and military officials who opposed it. All of the common people in the world would not agree to it either. Wu Zetian had spent decades to complete this magnificent feat, and there were many complicated things involved. Her success could not be replicated, otherwise, why would there only be one female empress in the past few thousand years? He could not count on the princess. He only hoped that the old emperor could hold on for 2 more years. The throne should not belong to the king of Shu. For the past 20 years, Li Yi had never thought that there would be a day where he would have to worry about who would be the next emperor. It's boring to be a human. Throwing those complicated thoughts out of his mind, he suddenly felt tired. Now he just wanted to go home and have a good sleep in bed. However, it was not so easy to realize the wish of going home to sleep, which was not a wish at all. "Mr. Li, please wait." Just as Li Yi was walking with his head down, a voice suddenly came from behind. Li Xian, the king of Shu, was not living a good life these days. Of course, it was not because he was worried about his father's health and became thinner and thinner, nor was it because the internal and foreign affairs of the Jing kingdom were at a delicate juncture. He cared about the world and the affairs of the country. This was because the censor named Wan Su was a bastard from head to toe. He had the audacity to accuse Wan Su of not behaving properly during his father's illness when so many ministers were urging him to be the crown prince. He, Li Xian, dared to say with his conscience that he had not behaved impolitely. He had been to the prince's mansion as usual, eating and drinking as usual, not once more or less. How could this be considered impoliteness? That bastard named Wan Su had revealed this matter when Prime Minister Qin had praised him as a rare talent in the heavens, a peerless talent in the mortal world, and a good candidate to become the crown prince. It was said that Prime Minister Qin's face had darkened at that time. Later on, Prime Minister Qin had specially paid a visit to Wan Su twice, but he had been blocked at the door. He hadn't even stepped into the Qin manor. The once-in-a-lifetime opportunity was ruined by Wan Su. The king of Shu wanted to cut him into pieces, but he could only think about it. The imperial censors were all bastards that could not be provoked. Li Xian was one of them, and so was Wan Su. Putting aside the fact that he was only the king of Shu, even if he became the emperor in the future, he would not be able to casually touch those people. As an upright official, they were the most upright and plain-spoken. They would pick on this and that all day long. They would not even let the emperor off. They would even wish for the emperor to chop off their heads. That way, they would be able to leave their names in history and be remembered for generations to come. Censors had never been killed since the beginning of the Jing kingdom. Had better not. If one did not want to be known as a tyrant in the future, he would be. Not. The king of Shu came to the palace this time to play the role of a filial son. He had already left a bad impression on the emperor, so he had to be more attentive to his father and make his presence known. Otherwise, he would not know how to explain to Prime Minister Qin. The court had not ended yet. Recently, because of the problem of the 2 cities of the Qi kingdom, the officials could not reach a consensus and were in a deadlock. Therefore, the morning court often ended very late. If the morning court did not end, his father would not come out. The king of Shu had to wait here for a while. He didn't wait for the court to end, but an unexpected person arrived. "County Li, please wait a moment." The king of Shu looked at Li Yi's back and suddenly spoke when he saw Li Yi walking past him, seemingly ignoring his existence. Hearing the voice coming from behind, Li Yi turned around. When he saw a figure standing there, he was stunned. Then he cupped his hands and said, "Your Highness, what's the matter?" "It's nothing important." The king of Shu took a step forward and said with a smile, "I haven't seen County Li since the last time we parted in the prince's mansion. I have been feeling guilty for not being able to apologize to County Li in person." "Apologize?" Li Yi looked at the king of Shu and did not know what he was up to. Or did he take the wrong medicine in the morning? "Last time, I did not figure out the cause of the matter and made County Li feel wronged." The king of Shu actually cupped his hands and bowed slightly to Li Yi. With his identity and status, it was very rare for him to do such a thing. "Your Highness, you are exaggerating. I don't remember what happened last time." No matter what the king of Shu was up to, Li Yi still remembered clearly how ruthless the king of Shu was last time. However, it was not good for him to fall out with him, so he said calmly. The king of Shu could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth. You don't remember? You didn't remember? You even beat Qin Yu so hard the next day. When I went to the Qin's mansion to see him, I almost did not recognize that the swollen pig head was Duke Qin. However, what the king of Shu cared about was not the pig head Duke Qin, but Li Yi, who caused all this. However, the king of Shu acted as if nothing had happened. Later, according to the county captain who went to the county mansion to arrest him, County Li actually had the token of the secret intelligence office. The moment he learned this news, the king of Shu realized that he had underestimated his father's regard for County Li. The emperor was even willing to give him the token of the secret intelligence office, which could be said to be a great favor. The king of Shu was smart because he knew that his father was very smart, which could often save him a lot of trouble. He did have some grievances with Li Yi, but in the face of certain things, these grievances were not worth mentioning at all. The king of Shu believed that County Li should also understand this. What's more, he had done the best he could just now. The king of Shu, the future emperor, had apologized to him personally. What else did he want? After showing his attitude, the king of Shu did not continue the topic just now. He looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, recently, the officials in the court have been arguing against the crown prince. County Li is highly regarded by my father. What do you think of this? This was a naked test, or rather, a cozying up. County Li was also a smart person, so he would definitely understand what he meant. What do you think? Li Yi said in surprise, I'm not in the court, so I naturally can't see or hear what happens in the court. Your Highness, I'm afraid you've asked the wrong person. The king of Shu looked straight at Li Yi, and the smile on his face gradually disappeared. Some things were very clear without saying, but everyone could understand. The king of Shu also understood what Li Yi said just now. He looked at Li Yi expressionlessly and said, County Li, are you really not willing to help me? The king of Shu's expression was cold, and the surprise on Li Yi's face gradually disappeared. Chapter 437. Since ancient times, those who achieved great things had many qualities, but none of them included what the king of Shu had displayed. That day at the king of Shu's residence, if not for Li Xian's appearance and the king of Shu's favoritism, things would definitely have gone out of control. Even Li Yi himself wouldn't have been able to control it. It could be said that after that day, although their relationship wasn't as bad as it was with Qin Yu, they wouldn't pretend that nothing had happened. He was fickle and two-faced. Not only could one not be friends with such a person, it was even more impossible for one to be a king and a minister. Before this, there were rumors that the king of Shu was talented in both literature and martial arts, had outstanding intelligence, and was easy to make friends with, but it was all bullshit. However, such a person with low IQ and EQ was the son of the imperial concubine, the eldest son of the current emperor, and the first in line to succeed the throne, and this successor had just completely fallen out with him. Thinking about it, he hadn't offended anyone at the start. This feud was too unjust. Oh, it's actually you. A rough voice suddenly came from the side. As soon as Li Yi turned his head, his shoulder was patted heavily twice. An old man glared at him and said angrily, You brat, you really don't know the rules. I heard that the ice-making workshops in the capital are run by your family. You don't know how to give gifts to your elders during the festive season. I won't reprimand you, but it's such a hot day and you don't even know how to look at it. I have to wait 3 days to buy a few pieces of ice from your shop. I'm telling you, I won't even wait a day. If you don't deliver the ice today, I'll personally come and tear down your shop. When the court ended, the first few officials who walked out of the hall saw the scene in front of them and found it funny. They didn't know which unlucky fellow had caught the eye of this unreasonable old General Shui. They were probably in big trouble now. At this moment, one of the officials suddenly walked out of the crowd and walked in front of old General Shui. He bowed and said, I don't know how my nephew has offended old General Shui. I apologize on his behalf. I hope old General Shui won't blame me. Go, 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 this has nothing to do with you. Old General Shui waved his hand at Li Mingze and said impatiently. Suddenly, he seemed to have discovered something. He turned his head and looked at the king of Shu. He pretended to be surprised and said, Hey, isn't this the king of Shu? When did you come? The king of Shu cursed in his heart. Just now, he had clearly walked past him, but he had ignored him. Yet, he was so familiar with Li Yi, and now he was questioning him. At the same time, he was surprised. This Li Yi. When did he become so familiar with old General Shui? Although old General Shui Wanqing was old, his reputation in the family of generals was unparalleled. Even the newly promoted fierce General Su Dingyuan couldn't compare to him. Old General Shui and the family of generals had always been his targets, but he hadn't succeeded yet. Seeing that old General Shui, who usually ignored him, was actually treating Li Yi so warmly, the king of Shu felt a little upset. No matter how upset he was, he still forced a smile and said to old General Shui with cupped fists, Li Xian pays his respects to old General Shui. Shui Wanqing just nodded to the king of Shu and looked at Li Yi again. He said loudly, Did you hear what I said just now? Li Yi was sure that although he had met old General Shui once, their relationship wasn't so deep that old General Shui would offend the king of Shu to help him out of trouble. Thinking of what he had said to the old generals in the hall that day, Li Yi felt moved. He had thought that they were just saying it casually and had not expected that he would actually do it. He bowed to old General Shui and said, This junior understands. Another old man walked over with a smile and said, Hee, I can't let you, old fart Shui, take all the benefits. My children are always making a ruckus. Little fellow, when you give the ice to old fart Shui, don't forget to bring my share as well. I'll be paying for it. Nonsense, Zhang, did I say that I won't pay? Old General Shui was furious and glared at the old man. Why is Sir Zhang also following? The surrounding officials were all surprised to see this scene. Old General Shui was famous for being a dissolute old man in the imperial court. It wasn't strange for him to do strange things. However, although Sir Zhang was also a general, he had always been calm. Why was he playing with old General Shui this time? Assistant Minister Li Mingze of the Ministry of Personnel stood still with a stunned expression. Things seemed to be a little different from what he had imagined. You two old men, how can you leave me out of such a good thing? In that case, this old man will have to join in as well. Seeing a few more old generals standing up with a smile, even great General Su Dingyuan stood up. The expressions on the faces of the surrounding officials were somewhat indescribable. It was said that a general's family was united, and it was indeed true. They even bullied someone together. What did Assistant Minister Li's nephew do in his previous life to be targeted by so many old generals? However, there were naturally smart people among the officials. At this moment, many of them looked at the king of Shu and then at the young man who was surrounded by a few old generals with a thoughtful expression. Move aside, how old are you? How dare you call yourself old man in front of me? Old General Shui waved his hand impatiently at Su Dingyuan, causing the crowd to tremble. In the entire Jing kingdom, there was no one else who dared to speak to General Su like this except for him. Disperse, disperse. What are you all doing here? Are you waiting for me to treat you to a meal? Old General Shui's words caused the crowd to disperse in an uproar. In the entire imperial court, no one dared to ask old General Shui to treat them to a meal, unless they were tired of living. The king of Shu also left. The moment he turned around, his face turned completely gloomy. He realized that he was wrong again. Who exactly was this Li Yi to be able to make so many old generals stand out without any fear of him? He even felt a little regretful. Perhaps, he had already made a mistake that day in the king's residence. After the king of Shu and the officials had dispersed, the frivolous expression on old General Shui's face gradually disappeared. He looked at Li Yi and asked seriously, Do you have a feud with the king of Shu? Thank you, generals, for your help just now. Li Yi did not answer directly. Instead, he bowed respectfully to the old generals. He did not have a deep relationship with these old generals, but they were willing to stand out at that moment and declare their stand in front of the king of Shu and the officials. This was a huge favor. If you can avoid offending the king of Shu, it's best not to. Old General Shui looked at him deeply and said. After saying that, he seemed to have thought of something and laughed again. He patted Li Yi's shoulder again and said, "Don't worry, before the few of us old fellows enter our coffins, we can still protect you for a period of time." After the old generals left, Li Yi did not feel happy because he suddenly had such a strong backer. Ever since the inexplicable invitation to the king of Shu's residence a few months ago, he seemed to have been involved in a matter that he did not want to be involved in at all. The old emperor's unfathomable thoughts, the crazy and perverted little Duke Qin, the king of Shu who was already in the late stages of paranoia. How good would it be to have a simple life? Why did there have to be so many troublesome matters? A trace of fatigue surged from the bottom of his heart, and his mind was in a mess. Unknowingly, he walked out of the palace gate. He did not even see the carriage of the Viscount's residence, nor did he see the sword-carrying lady standing beside the carriage. Chapter 438. Second Miss, seeing that their Lord Ju walked straight past the carriage without even looking at them, a guard driving the carriage showed a little surprise on his face. He looked at the woman holding the sword and said. A trace of doubt also appeared on Mississippi Lu's face. Then she waved her hand and said, "Follow me slowly." Li Yi walked slowly along the street and gradually walked out of the city gate. There was always a figure following him more than 10 feet behind him. Mississippi Lu's expression changed from confusion and surprise at the beginning to worry. Because he had been like this for a whole hour. Mississippi Lu's expression began to become a little solemn. This Li Yi made her feel very unfamiliar, even more unfamiliar than the Li Yi who said, "I say, get off," to her on the arena of the brothel in Qing and Prefecture. Viscount's mansion. In the shade of a big tree at the entrance, old Fong sat beside a short table with his legs crossed. He was chatting with Butler Li casually. His lips were curled up and his face was full of smiles. The word "happy" was almost written on his face. "Is there anything happy today?" Steward Li picked up a few side dishes with his chopsticks and took a sip of wine. He narrowed his eyes comfortably and looked at Fong. No. Fong waved his hand and took a big gulp of wine. He laughed and said, "What can I be happy about?" Steward Li shook his head. His expression was so obvious that even the dog that stuck out its tongue on the side could see that he was in a good mood. Fong picked up a few pieces of meat and looked up to see a figure coming from a distance. He suddenly stood up from the stool, strode over and said, "Young master, guess what I saw in the city today?" "That group of Jade Courtyard, young master." Fong looked confusedly at Li Yi, who didn't even pay attention to him and walked straight into the mansion. For a moment, he was a little confused, so much so that he even forgot something that made him excited until now. When he looked back, the carriage of Viscount's mansion was actually following behind. He wondered why the young master would walk back by himself without even sitting in the carriage. Until he saw Second Miss, who also didn't look very good, came over. A hint of understanding appeared on his face. "Second Miss, did you quarrel with the young master again?" When Mississippi Lu walked past him, Fong couldn't help but ask tentatively. As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he felt that it was inappropriate. He raised his head and saw the cold eyes of Second Miss Lu. He immediately shivered and reacted faster than the dog lying on the ground with its tongue sticking out. In an instant, he disappeared. "Young master." Xiao Huan was washing the 2 clothes that Li Yi changed out of yesterday in the corridor. Seeing him coming in from outside, she immediately raised her little face. Rui came out from inside, looked at him and said with a smile, "You're back, husband. Have you eaten? If not, I'll immediately tell the kitchen to make it." "I have eaten," Li Yi said in a low voice, then walked into the room and said, "I'm a little tired, I'll sleep for a while." "If there's nothing, don't let anyone disturb me." A trace of doubt appeared on Rui's face, but she still nodded. Xiao Huan washed her hands and ran in. As she made the bed, she muttered in a low voice. This year's Chinese Valentine's Day, she must ask Uncle Fong and the others to help build a smart building that was taller than last year's. These days, several servant girls in the mansion have been talking about how tall the smart buildings of the rich families in the capital were. She must not be inferior to them. Is Chinese Valentine's Day coming soon? Li Yi took off his outer clothes and murmured. He looked at the servant girl and asked, "What day is it today?" The servant girl counted with her fingers, and after a while said, "June 18th, hearing this number, Li Yi was startled. After a long time, he sighed, and then a weak voice came over. June 18th, it's been a whole year. After Xiao Huan closed the door, she stood at the door and listened for a while. She didn't hear any other movements inside. She murmured in a low voice with some doubt, "What a year, did anything happen today?" In the courtyard, Rui looked at Mississippi Lu and asked in confusion. "I don't know." Mississippi Lu shook her head. She didn't enter the palace with Li Yi today. After he came out, he became like this. She had no idea what happened. Rui didn't ask anymore, but when she looked at the tightly shut door, her face couldn't help but show some worry. Not knowing why, after coming out of the palace, Li Yi felt especially tired, especially after hearing Xiao Huan talk about today. This kind of tiredness was not only physical, but also psychological. Lying comfortably on the bed, the double tiredness was released. He just wanted to sleep like this until the end of time. Sensing that the atmosphere in the residence wasn't right, the servant girls and servants in the Viscount's residence were especially careful these days. There were no more maids discussing how the residents would spend the double 7th festival half a month later. Lord Ju had not stepped out of that courtyard for a few days. Miss Xiao Huan's face was filled with worry. Second Miss never had a good look on her face. Even Furen's face occasionally had a trace of worry. The servant girls and servants worked quietly, for fear of making the slightest sound. Lying on the bed, Li Yi looked a little haggard. In fact, he had slept enough these days, but he still felt very tired. Ever since that special day, the negative emotions hidden somewhere in his body suddenly erupted. Other than sleeping, he felt that everything else was tasteless. But even if he fell asleep, it wasn't peaceful. There would always be some strange things in his mind. One moment, he was wearing an ancient costume and sitting in a bus, greeted by the surprised and scrutinizing eyes of the people on the bus. The next moment, he was wearing an Adidas sportswear and standing in the court with headphones plugged into his ears. The song in the headphones was Jay Chou's Back to the Past, and the person sitting on the throne above him was the King of Shu, who was looking at him with a sarcastic gaze. Then, he would hear his mother's long-lost nagging. Once, when he was forced to marry, he found a woman on the street and brought her home. The woman looked the same as Rui. Similar images and pictures often appeared in his mind. Sometimes, he was lying on the rocking chair in the Willow Leaf Village, the little servant girl massaging his shoulders behind him. Mississippi Lu's graceful figure was in front of him, and he could see Rui's busy figure in the kitchen from the corner of his eye. Then, the hateful faces of Qin Yu and the King of Shu would appear at the right time. Then he would wake up, eat, and continue to feel sleepy after eating, and so on. What should we do? Son-in-law has been sleeping for 5 whole days. The little servant girl sat on a stone bench in the courtyard, her little face full of worry. Apart from sleeping very much, there was nothing abnormal about the young master. At first, she thought that the young master was sick. Later, she even invited the imperial physician from the palace, but the imperial physician couldn't tell what was wrong. He didn't even write a prescription, and he even said that the young master was the best doctor. What kind of lousy imperial physician was that? His medical skills were all lies. A figure with his hands behind his back walked out of the room, and the little servant girl hurriedly ran over. Rui, who had been waiting outside, immediately walked over and asked, "Second uncle, how is it?" The old man waved his hand and said, "This is his own demon. If he can walk out of it, it will be over. If he can't walk out of it," before finishing his words, second uncle left the courtyard with his hands behind his back. "How is this possible? My husband's martial arts are not good, how could he encounter a demon?" Rui looked into the room, and her face became a little pale. Mississippi Lou's knuckles turned slightly white as she held the sword. She felt a little panic in her heart, and this panic even exceeded the Cold War between the two of them not long ago. She couldn't help but think of last year's Chinese Valentine's Day, and the side of him that she had never seen before when he was alone. So that person had always existed? That person, what was he doing in loneliness? Li Yi felt very tired. His forehead was full of sweat, and many wounds on his body were bleeding, but he still didn't put down the autumn water in his hand. This was because there were countless people in front of him, 10 Qin Yus, 8 King of Shoes, 6 Wu Yings, and countless men with scars on their faces. He slashed one at a time, until he was exhausted and fell to the ground weakly. He saw 2 Qin Yus pounce on him with a strange smile on their faces, the King of Shoes sneering behind him, and Wu Ying looking at him coldly with his sword. At this critical moment, Li Yi silently said in his heart, "Rui, Rui, follow my heart, quickly appear," and then, a figure appeared. A white and slender hand held the autumn water, dressed in white. One person and one sword, all eyes were filled with sword light. 1 Qin Yu fell, 2 Qin Yus fell, and all 8 King of Shoes fell. A moment later, only a standing figure was left in front of him. At this moment, the woman turned around, and with her back facing the corpses on the ground, she slowly reached out to him. Li Yi raised his hand with difficulty, held her hand tightly, and then woke up. He saw Mississippi Lou standing in front of the bed, looking at him. She held the autumn water in one hand, and he held the other hand tightly. The morning sun shone in through the window, and it was slightly dazzling. Li Yi narrowed his eyes, looked at Mississippi Lou, and said softly, "Morning." Chapter 439. When Miss Xiao Huan smiled and began to discuss Chinese Valentine's Day with them again, the maids of the Viscount's mansion knew that the crisis was over. So the dark cloud over the servants' heads slowly dissipated, and the warm sunshine shone in again. "What are you thinking about?" After breakfast, Li Yi sat on a stone bench in the yard and looked at the sky in the distance. A cold voice came from the side. "Home." Li Yi didn't look back. He just looked at the sky and said one word. Even if he had integrated into this place, there was a fact that would never change. The matter of the King of Shu was just a prelude. The real reason why he was so depressed these days was still here. Mississippi Lou frowned and said, "Didn't you just come back from Qing and Prefecture? Do you want to go back again?" Li Yi finally looked back at her with a smile on his face and said, "I can't go back." Even though he was smiling, no matter how she looked at it, Miss Lu felt that there was a deep sense of helplessness and desolation in that smile. She bit her lower lip and thought for a while. Then she said, "There is nothing good in the capital. We can go back." Li Yi knew that she wouldn't understand. Whether it was Qing and Prefecture or the capital, there was no special meaning to him. He stood up and said apologetically, "I'm sorry to have made you worry these days." Second Miss Lu glanced at him indifferently, then turned around and left. "Rui." Hearing the voice behind her, she stopped. "Thank you." She looked back at him and asked, "What is it?" "Nothing." Li Yi stood up, waved his hand, and walked into the room. Inexplicable. Mississippi Lou stood in the same place for a long time. Her face softened slightly, but she still curled her lips and said, "In the palace, in the hall of diligent government, Emperor Jing put down the memorial in his hand. Looking at the mountain of political affairs that still needed to be dealt with, he let out a long breath and couldn't help feeling a little powerless. 2 hours are up. Your Majesty should rest." Changde's figure appeared behind Emperor Jing like a ghost and whispered. Jing Di had long been accustomed to his appearance. He picked up the teacup on the table to moisten his throat. He thought of something and casually asked, "How is Li Xianzi's health?" Changde bowed. "It was the same as yesterday." Emperor Jing frowned and asked, "What did the imperial physician say?" Changde said, "County Magistrate Li is only drowsy. The imperial physician has not made a conclusion. He only said that he might have fallen ill from worry. As for when he will recover, it will depend on County Magistrate Li himself." Worry turning into illness? Emperor Jing was stunned for a moment, then he shook his head and said, "What does he have to worry about? Does he have more things to worry about than me?" Changde thought for a while and said, "It said that Li Xianzi and the king of Shu had a conversation that day and they parted on bad terms." King Shu? Emperor Jing thought for a while and said, "If it's just because of the king of Shu, it doesn't seem like his character. I'm afraid there are other reasons. However, Li Xianzi has been a little restless these days. Does he want me to die early?" When Emperor Jing said the second half of the sentence, his tone was a little harsh. When it came to this topic, Changde habitually kept silent. Looking at His Majesty's face, he couldn't help but think of the dispute between hundreds of officials in the court about the position of crown prince these days. A trace of sarcasm appeared in his turbid old eyes. At this moment, a eunuch came in from outside and said respectfully, "Your Majesty, the person has been brought here and is now waiting outside the palace gate. Go and see what's going on with him for me." Emperor Jing ordered Changde and then said to the eunuch, "Let him in." A moment later, when a thin young man with a trace of uneasiness on his face walked through the palace gate under the leadership of two eunuchs, Princess Shaning was lying on the brocade couch, feeling the cold wind and muttering something. Big liar who doesn't keep his word. He promised to cook and treat us to dinner personally. It's been a few days, but there's no news at all. But Brother Xian said that he's sick. It seems that we can't blame him. Buddha, bless him to get better soon. Ning, what are you doing? Concubine Yen came in from outside and asked in confusion when she saw her daughter kneeling on the bed with her palms folded and muttering something. Ah! A trace of panic appeared on Princess Shaning's face, but she quickly recovered. She jumped off the bed barefooted and ran to Concubine Yen. She hugged her and said, "I'm asking Buddha to bless my mother. Bless her to always be as young and beautiful as she is now." "Child, what are you talking about?" Just when Concubine Yen didn't know whether to laugh or cry at her daughter's words, Concubine Wei was frowning in her palace. The palace maids who served her were all careful, for fear of accidentally angering Concubine Wei. Concubine Wei asked a eunuch with a sullen face, "What's wrong with Han, recently? He's been locking himself in his room all day. What is he doing?" The eunuch knelt on the ground and trembled. He said in a trembling voice, "I don't know. His Highness Prince Jean didn't let us in at all. I only heard His Highness Prince Jean say, 'Fang Cheng,' and 'sister' from outside the door. I really don't know what His Highness is doing." "Fang Cheng, who is Fang Cheng?" Concubine Wei frowned and muttered, "Sister? Could it be that my son was bullied by Princess Shaning again? No, I must go and tell His Majesty today. Concubine Yen should discipline her daughter." At this moment, somewhere in the side hall, a little fatty who had lost some weight was chewing on an ice cube. The pen in his hand was moving quickly on a piece of paper. The problems of the chicken and rabbit were now a piece of cake for him. He had figured out the problem of filling the pool with water yesterday, and he could recite the multiplication formula backwards. Although he had only solved part of the problems in the booklet in his hand, it had far surpassed the task that the teacher had given him. When the next lesson came, wouldn't his little red flower surpass that of Imperial Sister Shaning and laugh proudly at all his brothers and sisters? When he thought of his name appearing at the top of the list and being posted outside the Bowen Hall, Prince Jean seemed to have forgotten all his setbacks and sufferings. He gritted his teeth and turned a new page. Something very interesting awaited him there, though he could not make head or tail of it. At the same time, in the Morning Dew Hall, Her Royal Highness threw away the sword in her hand in annoyance. An old woman with a face full of wrinkles watched from afar and shook her head helplessly. Her Royal Highness had been feeling restless these past few days. It was really not suitable for her to practice martial arts. In another palace, a small figure sat on the stone steps in front of the palace. He held a large doll in his arms and looked in the direction of the palace gate anxiously. Chapter 440. Recently, the most important thing in the imperial court was how to deal with the two cities seized from the Qi kingdom. The civil and military officials had different opinions, and even the emperor found it difficult to make a decision. In contrast, the matter of appointing a crown prince was temporarily put aside. His Majesty did not reveal any intention of appointing a crown prince even though Prime Minister Qin had made such a big fuss. The officials naturally knew what to do. After a long time, even Prime Minister Qin seemed to have temporarily given up and did not mention this matter again. Of course, it might also be because Prime Minister Qin had fallen ill from anger and had not yet recovered, so he did not attend court these days. In a spacious hall in the Qin mansion, Prime Minister Qin sat in the seat of honor. Although his face was a little pale, his complexion was generally good. It seemed that he was far from the rumors that Prime Minister Qin was inferior to the people of Qi when debating scriptures. He was so angry that he vomited 3 liters of blood on the spot and almost died. Prime Minister Qin, what should I do now? The King of Shu sat on the left side of Prime Minister Qin, looking slightly anxious. He had thought that with his identity and status, the position of crown prince was easy to obtain. All he needed was a personal edict from his father. However, the recent events had shaken his confidence. He had almost taken advantage of the right time, the right place, and the right people. As long as he took a small step forward, he would be able to sit on the position that he had dreamed of. However, in the end, the King of Shu sadly found that he seemed to be even further away from that position. Prime Minister Qin glanced at the King of Shu. For a moment, he also wondered if it was appropriate for him to be the future emperor of the Jing kingdom. He did not need him to be as wise and far-sighted as the current emperor, but he should at least be half as wise, right? However, the recent events that had happened to the King of Shu made him doubt himself. Perhaps this was the reason why the emperor had not appointed the King of Shu as the crown prince? He shook his head and suppressed this thought. He said slowly, the empress did not give birth to a prince for his majesty. Concubine Yan also only has one daughter, Princess Shaoning. Prince Jin is still young and unable to bear the responsibility. Your Highness is the son of concubine Shui and is the eldest son of His Majesty. Therefore, Your Highness does not need to do anything but wait patiently. Although Prime Minister Qin's analysis was very reasonable, the King of Shu was still somewhat uncertain. The crown prince was supposed to be his, but he was still the King of Shu. Where had all the logic gone? Had it been eaten by the dogs? A trace of annoyance appeared on King Shu's face as he said, I really don't know what father is thinking. Watch your words, Your Highness. Prime Minister Qin's face suddenly darkened and he coldly said, even if you are a prince, you should not try to figure out the emperor's will. This is not something you should say. The King of Shu revealed an embarrassed expression and said, yes, Prime Minister Qin is right. I was rash. Isn't this in front of Prime Minister Qin? Prime Minister Qin's expression was still solemn as he said, you shouldn't say that even in front of me. Yes, yes. Prime Minister Qin was his thickest thigh. The King of Shu did not dare to put on airs in front of him and could only nod his head. A moment later, Qin Xiang watched the King of Shu walk out of the main hall. He stood up from his chair and walked to the door, letting out a long sigh. At this moment, he could not help but doubt his own perseverance again. Although the ancestral rules could not be disobeyed, was it really possible to hand over the great land of the Jing kingdom to such a person? In the past, Emperor Gaozu was so heroic that he could reverse the decline and build such a huge foundation in the chaotic times. After several generations of emperors, the Jing kingdom had become what it was today. Although the current emperor was not as domineering as Emperor Gaozu, he was a rare leader of a resurgence. These years, the politics of the Jing kingdom were clean and peaceful, all thanks to His Majesty. Even the expansion of land that generations of emperors could not achieve was miraculously completed a few days ago. It was a pity that His Majesty's health. Not only was the King of Shu not as talented as His Majesty in politics, he was also not as good as His Majesty in judging people. The current capital magistrate Dong Wenyun, Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Personnel Li Mingze, and many other juniors who shone brightly in the court and were destined to become pillars of the government in a decade or two, which one of them was not personally promoted by the emperor. It was precisely because of this that he paid much attention to Li Yi, Li Xianzi, who had entered his eyes recently and was highly valued by His Majesty. Even though he did not have a good impression of Li Yi, he had already stopped judging people based on his own preferences decades ago. As the Prime Minister of a country, Qin Xiang could naturally find out things that others could not. Therefore, ever since the name Li Yi first appeared in the records of the Ministry of Personnel, Qin Xiang knew everything that he had done. Essays, poems, mathematics, horseshoes, heavenly punishment, improved interrogation by torture, first aid in the military, making ice in summer, liquor, perfume. Qin Xiang could still remember how shocked he was when he saw these things. He immediately understood why His Majesty valued him so much and even made an exception to let him teach so many princes and princesses. It should be known that in the past, this was a special honor that only great scholars had. This was a truly talented person. He alone was comparable to countless ministers in the court. No wonder he was so favored by the emperor. His Majesty definitely wanted to train him to be the backbone of the next emperor. He was the fortune of the country. With such a person, the next emperor would probably go even further, although he himself would not be able to see it. From the perspective of the Prime Minister of a country, at that moment, Qin Xiang's dissatisfaction with Li Yi disappeared. Then he learned of the grievances between Li Yi, Qin Yu, and the King of Shu. The Qin family was now tied to the King of Shu. If the King of Shu did not ascend the throne, the Qin family would definitely become a thorn in the side of the new emperor and would inevitably be destroyed. If Li Yi could be used by the King of Shu, it would be a great blessing for both the Qin family and the King of Shu. Unfortunately, that day, when he left the court, he saw Li Yi and the King of Shu. Later, he heard that County Magistrate Li had fallen ill because of the threat from the King of Shu. It seemed that there was no room for reconciliation between the two. It's a pity. Qin Xiang sighed and said slowly. I heard that Li Yi was frightened by your highness and fell ill. Qin Yu looked at the King of Shu indifferently and asked. The King of Shu showed some sarcasm on his face and said, when I went to see my father that day, I heard about this from the imperial physician. I only asked him a few questions, but who would have thought that he would be so timid? It seems that I overestimated him before. After that, he looked at Qin Yu and said, if you want to touch him, you'd better bear with it for some time. I don't know why my father thinks so highly of him. In the future, with your means, I'm afraid that you can play with him however you want. Qin Yu knew what the King of Shu was talking about in the future. However, every time he thought of the humiliation he had suffered in those 2 days, he wished that he could cut him into pieces. He really could not wait for that time to come. Chapter 441. If you can't cure it, you can forget about your reputation as a miracle-working doctor. At the entrance of the Viscount's mansion, a gray-haired old man was dragged in by Li Xian. Your Highness, this is a disease that even imperial physician Lu can't cure. I'm afraid I can't either. The old man looked embarrassed. A miracle-working doctor could not cure all diseases. Although he thought his medical skills were good, he dared not say that he was better than the imperial physician of this dynasty. Li Xian simply shook his head and said, I don't care about this. You find a way yourself. After all, he was a well-known miracle-working doctor. The old man swore in his heart that if it were not for the fact that he could not afford to offend the crown prince in front of him, he would have given him a big slap. Hello, child Li Xian. Xiao Huan walked out of the yard with a pile of clothes in her arms. When she saw Li Xian standing at the door, she said with a smile. Li Xian was startled when he saw this. Over the past few days, he had seen the little servant girl frowning and distressed. After a moment, he seemed to realize something and a look of joy appeared on his face. He strode into the courtyard. Long time no see. Li Yi stood in front of the stone table in the yard. When he heard the hurried footsteps behind him, he said without looking up. Li Xian was stunned for a while. Long time no see. These days, he came here several times a day and almost broke the threshold of the Viscount's mansion. Are you okay? He didn't care about this. He looked up and down at Li Yi and asked suspiciously. What can happen to me? Li Yi's eyes were still on the stone table, and then he replied. What are you looking at? It was rare for Li Yi to be so serious. Li Xian couldn't help but lean over. He thought it was something interesting, but it turned out to be a rough map of the Jing kingdom. Li Xian glanced at it and suddenly lost interest. For the past few days, he had been focused on finding the godly doctor and had put aside many of the things on hand. If that so-called divine doctor still couldn't do anything, Li Xian decided to find trouble with the king of Shu first. There were rumors in the outside world that Li Yi had fallen ill because of the king of Shu. Although Li Xian wanted to spit on those people, he still had to find the king of Shu to vent his anger first. What's so interesting about a map? Let's go, I'll take you to a good place. He shook his head, stepped forward, and grabbed Li Yi's arm. I'm not going. Li Yi waved his hand but didn't break free. As Li Xian dragged Li Yi out, he said mysteriously, Don't worry, you won't regret it. Son-in-law, where are you going? As soon as Fang stepped out of the gate of his house, he saw his son-in-law being dragged out by the crown prince. Seeing them get on the carriage, he immediately trotted after them. Not long after the carriage of the crown prince's mansion disappeared, a cloud of dust rolled over from afar. Several fast horses stopped at the entrance of the viscount's mansion. Changde turned over and dismounted. The two guards of the viscount's mansion bowed to him. Changde waved his hand and walked straight in. There were only two maidservants busying about in the courtyard. In the shade of a large tree in the corner, an elder was lying on a strange chair, dozing off. Changde's gaze swept across the courtyard, and he asked one of the maidservants, Where is your Lord Ju? Lord Ju went out just now. The maid was startled by the sudden strange voice in the courtyard. After coming to her senses, she hurriedly replied. Went out. Changde had a trace of doubt on his face. Didn't they say that Li Xianzi had been sleeping in bed these days and hadn't stepped out of the house? Was the news false? My husband just went out not long ago. May I ask who you are and why are you looking for him? Rui walked out of the moon gate and looked at the old man standing in the courtyard. His illness. Changde opened his mouth and said. Suddenly, his pupils shrank and a trace of surprise appeared on his old face. He raised his head to look at the woman in front of him. After a while, he calmed down and said, Has he recovered from his illness? It's no longer a big problem. Rui nodded and said. In that case, I'll take my leave. Changde said indifferently. After taking another look at the woman in front of him, he simply turned and left. Rui didn't ask for the identity of the other party. The man's voice was so feminine, so he could only be someone from the palace. Her husband was right. There were experts among the eunuchs. Even in her eyes, the old man standing in the courtyard just now didn't have any flaws. So it's like this. When Changde walked out of the door, a surprised expression appeared on his face again and he murmured in a low voice. He knew that the two women surnamed Lu who were related to Li Yi were very good at martial arts. Before this, he had only seen the second miss of the Lu family. He never expected that her elder sister, Li Yi's wife, would be so powerful. Just as he stepped out of the door, Changde suddenly stopped and his expression changed greatly. He turned his head abruptly and his robe fluttered even though there was no wind. His face was full of vigilance. In the courtyard, two servant girls were cleaning the courtyard. The old man lying under the tree was snoring softly. The woman just now had already disappeared. Was it an illusion? After looking a few more times, he didn't see anything unusual in the courtyard. He shook his head and turned to leave. The sound of horse hooves sounded outside and quickly disappeared. Didn't I just sleep for a few more days? What's there to worry about? This old man has slept for a lifetime, second uncle, who was lying on the rocking chair, turned over and adjusted himself to a comfortable position. He muttered a few words and went back to sleep. Li Yi should have expected this, but he never would have imagined that the place Li Xian dragged him to was the Jade Yard. He should have known that every time Li Xian mysteriously dragged him to a place, it could only be the Jade Yard. What he didn't expect was that the capital also had a Jade Yard. Soon, he realized that things weren't so simple. Even if there was a jade yard in the capital, it couldn't have a madam who looked exactly the same, right? Seeing his surprised expression, Li Xian said proudly, "How is it? Doesn't it feel familiar? Like you've returned to Qing and Prefecture?" Li Yi felt a sense of familiarity with this place. After being dragged here by Li Xian so many times, it would be strange if he didn't feel familiar. Li Xian explained, "I also didn't expect that the madam would move the jade yard from Qing and Prefecture to the capital. The original brothel here is gone. When the crown prince came to the brothel, he always listened to music. He never called a girl into the room alone to talk about life and ideals. A 5-star brothel like the Jade Yard didn't just deal in sex. There were often talent shows on the stage in the middle. If the madam wanted to promote a girl, she would increase the frequency of her appearance. When the customers were familiar with her, her value would naturally rise." Li Xian had only dragged Li Yi over to watch the talent show, to adjust his mood. After all, when he saw the familiar jadeite courtyard in Beijing, his heart was filled with excitement for a long time. Even the madam's ugly face became amiable. However, the two of them didn't come at the right time. The seats downstairs were all taken. There wasn't even an empty table. "Your Highness, do you want to?" a guard whispered in his ear. Li Xian waved his hand and said, "Isn't there a seat over there?" He walked to a table, looked at a young man sitting there and asked, "Brother, may I ask if we can sit here?" Chapter 442. The young man was the only one sitting at this table. The other 3 seats were empty. However, it was not common to share tables in a place like a brothel. Behind the young man stood 2 men in cyan. Seeing this, they frowned and stepped forward. When they were about to speak, the young man waved his hand at them. Then he turned back and said with a smile, "Why not?" "Thank you." Li Xian cupped his hands at him. After sitting down, he turned back to look at the young man and said, "Thank you, brother. This meal is on me." "Then I should say thank you." The young man smiled. He raised the wine glass in front of him and gestured to the 2 men. Li Yi looked around and found that even the decoration here was similar to the Jade Yard in Qing and Prefecture. When he was in Qing and Prefecture, he didn't feel anything special, but now it looked very familiar. When he looked to his side, he found that something was missing. He asked in confusion, "Where's Fong?" When he went out just now, Fong had been following him. How could he disappear in the blink of an eye? One of Li Xian's guards also said in confusion, "He was here just now, forget it." Li Yi waved his hand. He was an adult, so he couldn't be lost. Although Fong looked simple and honest, he was actually as cunning as a ghost. Maybe he had gone to find an old lover of his. Places like brothels rarely moved, especially when they moved for hundreds of miles. Once they became famous in a certain place, the girls in the brothel would also have regular customers. Moving to another place meant that they had to start a new business and start over. No one knew what the result would be. Not all brothels had this kind of courage. However, the Jade Yard was different. If we didn't meet in the Jade Yard, we would meet under the moon on the Yaotai. When these 2 lines spread throughout the Jing kingdom along with the goddess of Luo Shui, a brothel called the Jade Yard in Qing and Prefecture frequently appeared in people's ears. The brothel was a place where talented scholars would hang around. If there was anything more famous than a classic poem that everyone would fight to sing, it would be a dozen or so. When the Jadeite courtyard became famous throughout the Jing kingdom, the madam of the Jadeite courtyard decisively formulated a 3-year plan. Within 3 years, the Jadeite courtyard would become one of the most famous buildings in the capital. This was the dream that she had when she was still a receptionist. One day, she would let those so-called top courtesans who looked down on her see that her abilities were not only in bed. In addition to other regular services and facilities, there was also a spacious and bright room in the building. The room was pasted with the portrait of the goddess of Luo Shui, including but not limited to the Luo Shenfu, Qing Pingdiao, and other poems praising the goddess of Luo Shui, which had long been circulated among scholars for people to admire. Of course, the brothel keeper tried so hard to buy the original poem manuscript from Zheng Zumo. Even if she offered a sky-high price, Zheng Zumo didn't agree. She could only settle for the next best thing. She took out the manuscript and made a copy. Even so, the price she paid made her heart ache. Because of this, the brothel keeper didn't mutter about the heartless goddess behind her back. Speaking of which, it was strange. Ever since those things were posted, every day, there would be some strange people standing in front of those copies. They would look at them for the whole day. They didn't eat, didn't drink, and didn't let the girls accompany them. Although these people seriously disrupted the order of the brothel, they were generous. Even if she offered a price of 10 taels of silver, they would just casually throw the money bag away and not even look at her. It was as if their eyes were grown on the wall. Over time, the brothel keeper let them be. As long as they paid, they could look at it for as long as they wanted. Who is the goddess of Luo Shui? Ever since Li Xian stepped into the jadeite courtyard, he had heard this name no less than 10 times in the short 15 minutes. He asked in confusion, since when did the jadeite courtyard have a goddess of Luo Shui? When the title of goddess of Luo Shui was first attached to Zheng Zumo, Li Xian was no longer in Qing and prefecture. Later, although her fame had spread to the capital, it couldn't compare to the influence in Qing and prefecture. Therefore, this was the first time Li Xian had heard of the name of goddess of Luo Shui. The young man opposite him asked with some surprise, "Brother, you seem to be quite familiar with the jadeite courtyard, but why don't you know of the goddess of Luo Shui?" "No." Li Xian shook his head and said, "What goddess of Luo Shui? Could it be the new top girl of the jadeite courtyard? Where is Lady Zumo?" When Li Xian said the second half of the sentence, he looked at Li Yi. "Redeemed her," Li Yi said casually. "What?" Li Xian was shocked. He even stood up from his seat and said, "Who redeemed her?" "You redeemed her? Did your wife agree? Your second daughter agreed?" "No, I didn't see her in your house." "Could it be that you secretly redeemed her and raised her in Qing and prefecture?" "That's not right. Didn't your family go back once some time ago?" "I don't think you have the guts." The young man opposite him was slightly stunned. He thought that it was strange that the person opposite him knew Lady Zumo but didn't know she was the goddess of Luo Shui. He was even more confused about what he had just said. Li Yi buried his head in his food and occasionally glanced at the young woman's dance on the stage. At this time, ignoring Li Xian was the right choice. Seeing that Li Yi didn't say a word and looked sad, Li Xian seemed to think of something. He sighed and said, "When we were in Qing and prefecture, I said that you should have made a move earlier. It's not easy for a woman to talk about this kind of thing. Moreover, Lady Zumo looks weak, but she is actually very strong-willed. Now, someone else has made the first move. It's too late to regret, she redeemed herself." Li Yi finally couldn't stand it anymore. He put down his chopsticks and explained. "Ah, redeemed herself?" The expression on Li Xian's face was stunned. He had the preconceived idea that the woman in the brothel must have been redeemed and taken back as a house. He was still feeling sorry for Li Yi. When he suddenly heard this sentence, he swallowed all the comforting words he wanted to say. The young man next to him showed a little surprise. He had been in the capital city for several months and had heard the name of the goddess of Luo Shui many times. However, although this jade courtyard was famous because of the goddess of Luo Shui, no one had ever seen the legendary woman. Listening to the words of the two noble young men in front of him, they seemed to know her and had a close relationship with her. Crash. When Li Xian was about to ask for more details, a girl in front of him who was carrying the dishes accidentally tripped and the tray in her hand fell out of her hand. Then there was a sound of dishes breaking. One of the guests was unexpectedly hit on the head by a dish, and his whole body was drenched with juice. He looked very embarrassed. Even the young man sitting opposite them was stained with some vegetable juice. "Little Red, you damn girl. Can't you watch where you are going?" Quickly apologized to the guest. A brothel steward immediately walked over and scolded loudly. Damn it, you're courting death. The unfortunate man was stunned for a moment. Then he realized what had happened and immediately jumped up from his seat. He didn't care about the steward's words just now. He looked at the girl who was standing there at a loss and scolded angrily. Then he slapped her face hard. A trace of fear flashed across the girl's face, but she didn't avoid it. She just closed her eyes tightly. In the end, the man's slap didn't fall on the girl's face. A young man grabbed his wrist. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't slap her. Chapter 443. The young man looked at the enraged man and said with a smile, "This lady did not mean it. Why do you have to make things difficult for a lady? I like it. It's none of your business." After being stopped, the man's anger did not subside. Instead, he became even more furious. He struggled to break free from the hand and tried to push the young man away. Bang! At this moment, there was a sudden dull sound in the hall. Before the man's hand could touch the young man, his body drew a beautiful arc in the air and flew straight out of the door. A man in green behind the young man followed him out with a gloomy face. Thank you, young man." The young woman's expression was still a little panicked. She hurriedly bowed to the young man. "It's all right. Just be careful in the future." The young man had already taken off his outer robe and said with a smile, "Little Red, what's wrong with you? You've been here for so long, but you're still so careless." When the young woman was being reprimanded by the brothel manager, the young man cupped his hands at Li Yi and turned to leave the brothel. "This guy is not bad." Li Xian glanced at the door and said to himself. Li Yi was thinking about something, so he didn't reply. Li Xian thought that he had just recovered from a serious illness. He did not talk as much as before. He only cheered along with the crowd when the performance reached its climax. The Crown Prince, who was well versed in the royal etiquette, completely let go of himself at this moment. After a while, when the two of them were about to leave, a steward came forward and said with a smile, "You too, that young man has already paid when he left." Didn't he have the final say? Li Xian muttered, but he did not care. In his heart, he had a higher opinion of that young man. When they returned, they still did not see Fong. Li Yi did not ask the guards to look for him and let him be. At this moment, in the backyard of the jadeite courtyard, the young woman who had just smashed the plate was sitting on a stone bench by the wall. She looked a little sad and murmured, "Sigh, this month's allowance is gone again." Then, "Are you injured?" After a long time, a voice came from outside the wall. The girl sniffed and said happily, "No, a young master helped me block it. He seemed like a very nice person." "Oh." It was still silent for a long time before a muffled voice came from outside the wall. "It's so nice to see you again in the capital." The girl patted the wall with one hand, and the smile on her face widened. This time, a voice came from outside the wall. The man laughed but didn't say anything else. "Hey, stop. You can't go in here." The urgent voice of the Jade Courtyard steward suddenly sounded. The young girl raised her head and saw that the steward was being pushed out from the inside. The man with a few bruises on his face scanned the courtyard angrily. When he saw the woman sitting by the wall, he sneered, "So you were hiding here? How much is this chick? I'm buying her today. Let our brothers have a good time." Seeing the girl's curvaceous figure, a trace of lust appeared on the man's face. He strode over and said, "Sir, isn't Little Red?" The steward hurriedly said and was kicked to the side by the men behind the man. "If you talk again, believe it or not, I'll tear down your broken brothel." Seeing the men approaching, the girl's face showed some fear, but she still gritted her teeth and didn't say anything. The man with the bruises on his face twitched and sneered, "Tch, I'd like to see who's going to stop me now." Just as the man finished speaking, he suddenly felt his vision go black. Something seemed to flash on the wall of the courtyard. Then, a huge shadow like a ferocious beast fell from the sky. "Where did you go?" Li Yi stood at the door and saw Fang leisurely stroll over from afar. He walked to the door and patted the dust off his body. I didn't go anywhere. I just wandered around in the city and came back. Fang shook his head and said calmly. Li Yi glanced at him. Your wife came to look for you just now. As soon as Li Yi finished speaking, Fang's expression changed drastically. If your wife asks later, you'd better say you went to the perfume workshop. Li Yi kindly reminded Fang and walked back to the courtyard with his hands behind his back. He felt that he needed to discuss with second granduncle how to solve his headache after sleeping for so long. Fang stood in the courtyard and stretched out his sleeve to smell it. He nodded in agreement. He didn't know the background of the workers in the capital city, so he was a little worried. It was better to keep an eye on them. The morning court session was not early. The emperor was benevolent and considerate of his subjects. He postponed the morning court session to about 8:00 in the morning. Compared with the previous practice of waiting at the palace gate in the middle of the night and entering the palace at dawn, the emperor's action made many aged subjects or those who lived far away feel deeply grateful. Li Yi didn't feel anything about this benevolent policy because he got up before dawn. When he arrived at the palace gate, many officials were still waiting there. Although the court session was set at 8:00, the emperor was benevolent and the subjects couldn't ask for a foot after being given an inch. Just after 7:00, there were already many people waiting at the palace gate. After glancing at the crowd, a eunuch led Li Xianzi into the palace from the side door. This scene made many officials stare with their eyes wide open. Although it was summer, it was still a little cold to stand here in the morning before the sun rose. Even the prime minister was freezing here. How could Li Xianzi enter the palace like this? All the officials in the imperial court knew that Li Xianzi was favored by the emperor, but until now, they didn't know how much he was favored by the emperor. It could even be said that if Li Xianzi didn't stand on the opposite side of the king of Shu, he would have a meteoric rise and become an influential figure in the imperial court, an existence that even they had to look up to. Unfortunately, Li Xianzi was still too young. At this time, almost everyone was thinking about the rumors in the capital city in recent days. Looking at the slowly closing side door, they all had different thoughts. Although Li Mingzi, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, looked calm, there was an unconcealable worry in the depths of his eyes. Beside him, Capital Governor Dong Wenyun looked in the direction of the palace gate with an uneasy expression. Several old generals frowned and gathered together to discuss something in a low voice. On the contrary, Prime Minister Qin and the officials who were close to the king of Shu looked relaxed. Many of them even had a trace of sarcasm and ridicule on their faces. So what if he was favored by the emperor? Even if he was favored by the emperor, how long could the emperor favor him? Only Prime Minister Qin didn't have any expression on his face. None of the officials standing beside him dared to look at the Prime Minister. Of course, no one saw the trace of pity in his eyes. Li Yi didn't know what the officials outside the palace were thinking. Led by the eunuch, they came to the familiar garden after a few turns in the palace. It was the same white fungus and lotus seed soup, the same home-cooked side dishes, and the faint fragrance of grape wine. Sit. A middle-aged man wearing only an undershirt sat opposite him and stretched out his hand. Chapter 444. Why? Is today's food not to your liking? Beside the stone table in the pavilion, Jing Emperor was eating to his heart's content. At a certain moment, he looked up at Li Yi and saw him carefully chewing a mouthful of lotus seed soup for a long time. He asked, "Your Majesty has misunderstood." Li Yi put down his chopsticks and said, "It's just that I have been seriously ill these days and have not recovered yet. My appetite is not good." Jing Emperor nodded and said, "I heard from the imperial physician that you are overly worried. You might as well tell me what you are worried about. Maybe I can help you." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I dare not trouble your Majesty. It's just that there are some knots in my heart that have not been resolved. I slept at home for a few days and am much better now." Jing Emperor looked at him and did not continue on this topic. He said, I have told you before that I will only grant you the title of nobility and not increase your official rank. It is said that a ruler does not go back on his words. But now, I really regret it. Li Yi raised his eyebrows and raised his head. Jing Emperor had already sighed and said, I don't have much time. There was a deep unwillingness and helplessness in his words. Li Yi did not answer. A wise ruler would, of course, want to live for a few more years and see the land that was becoming richer and stronger in his hands. However, there were some things that he couldn't escape even if he was a ruler who received orders from the heavens. A few days ago, the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War resigned. I want you to take over this position. What do you think? Li Yi still did not know what kind of promotion it was to go from having no official position to being the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War. He also did not know how many officials in the court would oppose this decision of Emperor Jing. He also did not know how shocking it was for the emperor to ask his own opinion on the appointment of an official. He only knew that he would not be the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War no matter what. Li Yi immediately stood up, bowed, and said, This subject thanks your majesty for your grace, but this subject is ill, and I'm afraid it's difficult for me to take on this heavy responsibility. I'm afraid I'll fail your majesty's expectations, and I hope your majesty can retract your order. Emperor Jing was not surprised by Li Yi's answer. He stood up and took 2 steps forward. With his back facing Li Yi, he looked into the distance and said, I remember the first time I saw you, it was in the garden of Prince Ning's mansion, right? At that time, I knew that you were ambitious, but your personality was lazy and you had no desire for an official career. I originally wanted you to polish yourself in the officialdom for a few years before summoning you back to the capital and entrusting you with heavy responsibilities. But even though you were far away in Qing and Fu, you still did so many things for me and for this country. But your personality, on the contrary, became more and more lazy. In one's life, one has to pursue something. Li Yi, what exactly do you want? Money or power? Li Yi was silent and didn't speak. I can give all of these to you. I really don't have much time. In the future, the world will be your world. I know you have great talent, and I don't want to wrong you. Now, tell me, what exactly do you want? Li Yi was silent for a while and then said, Your Majesty has given me a lot. I am already satisfied and have no other requests. The atmosphere in the pavilion sank into a long silence. After an unknown amount of time, a hoarse voice broke the silence. Changde walked forward and said in a small voice, Your Majesty, it's time for morning court. Your Majesty is so generous, but this little fellow is so evasive. In my opinion, Your Majesty only needs to give an order. Whether or not he is the assistant minister of the Ministry of War, it doesn't matter. Looking at the middle-aged man standing in the pavilion with his hands behind his back, Changde thought for a moment and said. At this time, there were only the 2 of them left in the pavilion. After a long time, Emperor Jing turned his head and sighed. He said, I'm afraid he already has the intention to leave. Hearing this, Changde paused and asked, Intention to leave? To where? Emperor Jing did not answer. His eyes drifted, and the thumb and index finger of his right hand unconsciously rubbed together. He murmured, The king of Shu is incompetent, and none of my princes are of great use. If they were half as capable as county magistrately, I wouldn't have to worry about this. Emingzu, if Emingzu was a man, even if she. Changde closed his mouth again. The weather today was gloomy, and the sky above their heads was covered with thick black clouds. It was likely that there would be a heavy rain. After Li Yi walked out of the garden, of course, he could not hear the conversation in the pavilion. He was thinking about something. When he passed by a palace, a figure suddenly flashed out from the corner of the wall. Princess Shaning pounced on him like a little tiger. She hugged his waist and said angrily, Liar, big liar. Didn't you say you would treat me to a meal? Li Yi pressed her little head and finally made her let go. He said, Lead the way, to the meal. The proud Lolita was stunned for a moment, and then a smile immediately appeared on her little face. Wait a minute, I'll go call my sister. She asked Li Yi to wait here, and ran to the morning dew hall while shouting. "Ah, Brother Xian is also here." Not long after, Li Xian, who was supposed to follow the officials to court, was discovered by the sharp-eyed Princess Shawning. She dragged him out of the crowd. The censor's eyes almost popped out. The officials spitting and farting on the way to court would be recorded in a small notebook by them, but for Princess Shawning's serious violation of the rules, he could only watch. No, he turned his head after a glance. Anyway, he couldn't do anything about it. What the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve, lest he got angry. Li Xian occasionally went to court, but he only played the role of a bystander. Just as he was worrying about how to pass the difficult morning court time, Princess Shawning undoubtedly gave him a way out. No matter how you looked at it, sitting in a cool room with 8 dishes and a soup in front of you was very appetizing. No matter how you looked at it, it was much better than leaning against a pillar in the court and dozing off, right? Gulp. Li Xian couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. Even though he had already eaten breakfast, he still felt that he could finish the big table of dishes in front of him by himself. Gulp. Princess Shawning's eyes widened. The scene in front of her was even more than she had imagined. She simply couldn't wait for the others to make the first move. She picked up a piece of pork rib and started gnawing on it. The supervisor of the catering department was really crying. With tears in his eyes, he looked at the 4 people who almost wiped out all the precious ingredients. He couldn't afford to offend any of them. He was extremely suspicious of what he had done in his previous life. Today, is it some special day? Li Xian's chopsticks flew like lightning. His mouth didn't stay idle either. He looked at Li Yi while eating and asked, "You guys eat." "You guys eat, I've already eaten just now." Li Yi washed his hands, said to them, and walked straight out. The proud Lolita's cheeks were puffed up, and she couldn't help but nod. Right now, food was everything. It couldn't be better that no one was fighting with her. Li Emingzu looked up, and a trace of doubt appeared in her eyes. She put down her chopsticks and stood up to follow. Oh, wait. Li Xian still had a piece of pork rib in his mouth. He took 2 more pieces and hurriedly chased after them. Chapter 445. Your Majesty, the position of Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War is very important. You can't be so hasty. In the court, an old official stood in front of the crowd and said quickly with a ceremonial tablet in his hand. Emperor Jing frowned and asked, "Is there anyone else who has an objection?" As soon as he finished speaking, another official suddenly stepped forward and said loudly, "Although Li Xianzi is a talented person, he is still too young and lacks experience. He can't take on such a heavy responsibility." Many officials looked at each other and saw the deep meaning in each other's eyes. They nodded slightly. "Your Majesty, please reconsider. Your Majesty, please reconsider. Your Majesty, please reconsider." One official stood out. 2 officials stood out. After a while, the court was densely packed with people. Among those who persuaded Emperor Jing to take back his decision to appoint Li Yi as the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War, there were those who were in Prime Minister Qin's faction, but there were more who were not in the Qin faction. The Ministry of War was in charge of the military affairs of the country. There was a Minister of War and 2 assistant ministers. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War was a rank 4 official. His status was only lower than the Minister of War. He was an official of the imperial court. How could he be appointed so hastily? Everyone knew that His Majesty favored Li Xianzi very much. But there must be a limit to his favor. If any official of the imperial court could be appointed like this without an examination, wouldn't the great country of the Jing kingdom be finished sooner or later? This country was His Majesty's country, but it was also the country that they had worked hard to build. The officials would not allow it to be destroyed, not even His Majesty. If His Majesty insisted on acting arbitrarily, then they could only remonstrate with death. Emperor Jing knew that his decision would definitely be opposed by many people, but he didn't expect that there would be so many people. Seeing the rows of officials standing out, his face couldn't help but darken. He originally wanted to let Li Yi start from the position of county lieutenant and promote him step by step, just like how he promoted others. But when he found that time was running out, he couldn't wait for Li Yi to be able to stand alone in the court and clear the obstacles for the new emperor. Naturally, he couldn't help but be anxious. However, even though he had the absolute right to speak, he could not disregard the opinions of so many courtiers. Otherwise, the entire court would be in chaos before his death. This was not his intention. In that case, we will discuss this matter later. Dismissed. Emperor Jing was annoyed. He waved his sleeves and strode away. I really don't know what kind of person this county magistrate Li is to be treated like this by His Majesty. A middle-aged official said leisurely. Everyone nodded in agreement. Although His Majesty did not take back his order, this was already the greatest concession a ruler could make. Seeing His Majesty leave, the courtiers finally heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, they could not help but feel a little envious and jealous of Li Xianzi. The assistant minister of the Ministry of War was an important position, and the emperor actually wanted to directly promote him. If other people's favor was like rain and dew, his could probably be described as a torrential downpour. Naturally, there were also many people who were curious. What exactly did the legendary Li Xianzi have that attracted His Majesty and made His Majesty pay so much attention to him? A person who was frightened and fell ill because of a few words from the King of Shu must be timid. How capable could he be? It had to be said that Li Xianzi had appeared too frequently in their eyes recently. When the officials walked out of the hall, more than half of them were talking about him. Of course, some people were secretly delighted. The matter of the two cities of the Qi kingdom had been settled, so the court was dismissed so early today. Except for the family of generals, the courtiers seemed to be in a one-sided state about the matter of Li Xianzi, so there was nothing to discuss. If there was nothing important, the court should be dismissed so early in the next few days, right? It was really a happy thing to be able to go back and have a meal earlier. On the stone steps of a palace somewhere, a little girl was sitting there with a doll in her arms and her eyes were fixed in a certain direction. The patrolling guards in the palace came and went. Occasionally, eunuchs and palace maids passed by, but none of them could make her eyes waver. After an unknown amount of time, at a certain moment, when a familiar figure appeared in her line of sight, her eyes suddenly lit up. She stood up from the stone steps and jogged into the distance. Your Highness, the King of Shu. The King of Shu's face was a little gloomy. He ignored the guards who saluted him. Because of his improper behavior when his father was seriously ill last time, the imperial censor could use it against him, so his reputation among the officials was greatly reduced. This morning, he was severely reprimanded by his mother for 2 hours and only came out now. He was extremely depressed. Just when the King of Shu was unable to vent his anger, a little shadow ran over from the front. The King of Shu looked up and recognized that it was his half-sister, the only silly sister of his. There had never been any kinship in the royal family. The King of Shu naturally had no feelings for Princess Yongning. He just felt that as a princess of a country, she should be so silly, which was really a disgrace to the royal family. Perhaps because she ran too fast, the little girl accidentally tripped and fell to the ground. The doll in her hands also flew out. She got up from the ground and didn't bother to pat the dust off her body or wipe the blood from her knees. Her expression was a little flustered as she looked around. The King of Shu looked at the dirty thing that had rolled to his feet and even touched the hem of his clothes with disgust. He raised his foot and stepped on it angrily. The little girl finally saw her doll. She limped over and tried to pull it out from under the King of Shu's feet. How could a 6-year-old girl compare to an adult man in terms of strength? When she realized that she couldn't pull the doll out, she raised her head and said softly, return it to me. It was said that Li Yi was very fond of this Princess Yongning. Therefore, when the King of Shu looked down, the disgust on his face deepened even though the little girl was pretty. The King of Shu looked coldly at the little girl who was begging on the ground. The vexation in his heart actually lessened a little. A cold smile appeared on his face. At some point, he finally released his foot. However, before the little girl could take the doll away, he kicked it harshly into the lotus pond at the side. When the two eunuchs behind the king of Shu saw this scene, their facial muscles twitched involuntarily. They thought to themselves, as an adult prince, how could he treat a little girl like this? No wonder His Majesty refused to pass the throne to him. His Majesty is wise. Of course, these words could only be thought in their hearts. They never dared to say it out loud. The little girl watched in a daze as the doll was kicked into the pond. As if all the strength in her body had been sucked out, she sat on the ground in a daze. 2 clouds of mist immediately appeared in her big bright eyes. She sobbed and said, "Return it to me, return my beautiful goat to me." Li Yi, who was walking over quickly, suddenly stopped. In that instant, there seemed to be countless roars of thunder in his mind. At the same time, in the distant main hall, hundreds of officials walked out one after another. In the sky above their heads, a circle of gold gradually appeared at the edge of the thick dark clouds. A ray of golden light shone through the dark clouds, followed by 10 rays, 100 rays, 1,000 rays, 10,000 rays. Behind the clouds, the long-awaited sun finally appeared. You're tuning into the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.